I am Emmett Vale, 34 years old, and the ink on the $30 million acquisition contract was still damp when my ex-husband smiled. He sat across the mahogany table in my Miami boardroom, adjusting his silk tie, fully believing he was outsmarting a faceless corporate conglomerate. He had no idea the woman observing him through the hidden security feed was the same woman he abandoned on a ventilator. 7 years ago, I woke up from a 2-week coma to an empty hospital room and a yellow sticky note that read, "I did not sign up for a sick wife." If you have ever been discarded by the person who promised to protect you, you need to hear this. Let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to Linda Vengeance to see how I turned my medical bankruptcy into a financial guillotine. The rhythmic chiming of the cardiac monitor was the first sensation anchoring me back to reality. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights of a Central Florida intensive care unit. My throat felt like shattered glass, a lingering souvenir from weeks of intubation following a sudden autoimmune crash. My muscles possessed zero strength. Lifting my hand felt like pulling weight through wet sand. I turned my head. The room was vacant. No flowers sat on the windowsill. No exhausted husband slept in the uncomfortable vinyl guest chair. There was only the quiet hum of the ventilation system and that neon yellow sticky note resting on the plastic rolling tray table. My pale fingers trembled as I reached for the small square of paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Julian. Sharp, hurried strokes pressing deep into the page. I did not sign up for a sick wife. A chilling numbness washed over my chest, far more potent than the intravenous painkillers dripping into my veins. I grabbed my cell phone from the bedside drawer. The battery icon glowed red at 12%. I dialed his number, desperate for an explanation, a twisted joke, anything to make sense of the empty room. The automated voice replied instantly. "The number you have reached is no longer in service." Panic tightened my breathing. I opened our joint banking application. The screen loaded, spinning a small blue circle before revealing the true depth of the betrayal. The checking account, the savings account, the emergency fund we built together, all read zero. The transaction history displayed daily maximum withdrawals, pulled day after day while I lay unconscious. A memory surfaced through the thick medical fog. Years ago, sitting at our cramped kitchen table in Orlando, I spent consecutive nights grinding through freelance data analytics to keep his early logistics startup afloat. I worked until my eyes burned just to ensure we could pay rent. I even taught Julian how to mimic my signature so he could accept certified business deliveries while I worked my day job. I purposely taught him a flawed version, leaving a disconnected loop on the letter E in my first name, just as an inside joke. Now, staring at the empty bank ledgers, that joke felt like a loaded weapon pointed directly at my head. He made a fatal error. He left me breathing. The heavy wooden door of the ICU room swung open. A hospital administrator stepped inside. She did not wear scrubs or a white coat. She wore a tailored navy suit and clutched a sleek digital tablet to her chest. She did not look at me with sympathy. Her eyes scanned the room with a cold, calculating detachment, assessing a financial liability rather than a recovering patient. "Good morning, Ms. Vale," she began, her tone clipped and rehearsed. "I need to discuss your billing status. Your husband contacted our administrative office 3 days ago." My voice was a raspy whisper. What did he say? The administrator adjusted her posture. "He retroactively canceled your primary health insurance policy. He cited a change in marital status and removed you as a dependent. Without active coverage, you are personally responsible for the accumulated intensive care charges." She tapped the screen of her tablet and printed a preliminary invoice from a small wireless machine attached to her belt. She stepped forward and placed the crisp white paper on my tray table, right next to Julian's yellow sticky note. I looked down at the itemized list of charges. The total rested at the bottom of the page. It was a staggering 6-figure number printed in stark black ink. I was bedridden. My body was actively failing. My husband had taken every dime I earned, and left me to drown in insurmountable medical debt. He expected the stress and the physical illness to finish me off. He wanted me to fade away quietly so he could step into his new life without the burden of a recovering spouse. I closed my eyes, focusing on the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I refused to grant him the satisfaction of my tears. Crying required energy, and I needed every single ounce of my strength to survive the impending fallout. I slowly folded the invoice and tucked it beneath my pillow. I promised myself right then that Julian Cross would pay for every single hour I spent in this hospital bed. The administrator cleared her throat, breaking the heavy silence. "We require a payment plan to be established within 48 hours, she stated, her pen hovering over her clipboard. Otherwise, we will be forced to initiate standard collection protocols and evaluate your eligibility for charity care transfer. I looked directly into her eyes. My voice was weak, but my resolve was solid iron. Give me the paperwork. I will sign it. She handed me a thick stack of admission and billing forms. I took her pen. My hand shook severely from the muscle atrophy, but I forced my fingers to grip the metal barrel. I signed my name on the dotted line. I made sure to connect the loop on the letter E perfectly. Julian had the flawed signature. I had the real one. As the administrator turned and walked out of the room, my phone vibrated on the mattress. A notification popped up on the screen. It was an email from a mutual acquaintance, an automated social media digest. The subject line caught my attention immediately. Congratulations to Julian and Savannah. I tapped the email. A high-resolution photograph loaded on the screen. It showed my husband standing on a sun-drenched beach wearing a tailored linen suit. He was smiling brightly, wrapping his arms around Savannah Sterling, his ambitious coworker. Savannah wore a stunning white designer dress. The caption announced their beautiful impromptu wedding ceremony in Miami. He married her barely 6 months after he walked out of this hospital room. He funded that lavish beachfront wedding using the savings account I built. He bought her designer dress with the money meant to pay for my medical care. A nurse entered the room holding a tray of liquid medications. She noticed the glowing screen of my phone and offered a sympathetic smile. "Let us get you cleaned up, honey," she said softly. "You have a long road of physical therapy ahead of you." I locked the phone screen, plunging the room back into quiet shadows. I did not want physical therapy. I wanted retribution. And the path to retribution required me to become a ghost. The state-mandated transport van smelled of stale antiseptic and damp upholstery. Every pothole on the Central Florida highway sent a sharp jolt of pain up my spine, a cruel reminder of my physical fragility. My transition from the intensive care unit to a low-income rehabilitation clinic felt less like a medical transfer and more like a penal sentence. The facility sat on the industrial edge of the city, flanked by chain-link fences and cracked asphalt. Inside the walls were painted a suffocating shade of institutional beige. The floor consisted of chipped linoleum tiles that echoed with the squeak of rubber-soled shoes and the heavy, rhythmic clatter of metal walkers. My assigned room was a cramped square shared with 3 other patients. The air constantly carried the faint odor of bleach and boiled cabbage. I spent my days staring at a water stain on the acoustic ceiling tiles, counting the drops of intravenous antibiotics as they traveled down the clear plastic tubing into my bruised arm. I had 0 financial resources to demand better care. Julian ensured my destitution was thorough. He weaponized my illness, stripping me of the health insurance I spent years paying into, leaving me at the mercy of an underfunded public system. Physical therapy began at dawn. The sessions were an exercise in profound humiliation. The first time the nurses helped me stand, my legs buckled instantly. My knees hit the thin exercise mat with a dull thud. My muscles atrophied from the prolonged coma, refused to support my own body weight. The physical therapist, a tired woman with kind eyes, told me to take it slow. She said recovery was a marathon. I did not have time for a marathon. I had a deadline. I gripped the cold steel of the parallel walking bars. My knuckles turned stark white under the fluorescent lights. Sweat stung my eyes, blurring my vision, but I forced my right foot forward, then my left. The physical agony was blinding, tearing through my weakened nerves, but I welcomed the pain. I used it. Every agonizing step across that worn linoleum floor was fueled by a singular burning focus. I pictured Julian sitting in his air-conditioned office, laughing, spending the savings I accumulated during years of late-night freelance coding. I let the injustice harden my spine. I was not just learning how to walk again, I was learning how to hunt. 6 months dragged by in a blur of grueling physical exertion and quiet, calculated planning. I secured a cheap prepaid smartphone using the meager disability checks the clinic's social worker helped me file for. I needed access to the outside world. I needed to observe my targets. Sitting on my narrow institutional mattress, I opened a fake social media account. I navigated to the profile of a mutual acquaintance, an old marketing director from Julian's firm. The algorithm fed me the exact poison I was searching for. A fresh photo album appeared on the glowing screen titled, "A Perfect Miami Union." I tapped the screen. The high-resolution images loaded, flooding my darkroom with the digital glare of unearned luxury. Julian stood on a pristine white sand beach, wearing a bespoke linen suit that easily cost 3 months of my current disability income. He looked tanned, healthy, and incredibly smug. Standing beside him, draped in imported French lace, was Savannah Sterling. Savannah was a junior account manager at his logistics firm. I remembered her vividly from the early company dinners I used to organize. She always ordered expensive vodka martinis, laughing too loudly at Julian's mediocre jokes. Savannah possessed a predatory gaze, always scanning the room to locate the most advantageous stepping stone. She climbed the corporate ladder by stepping on the shoulders of the people who actually did the heavy lifting. In the photos, Savannah held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, her manicured hand resting triumphantly on Julian's chest. She sparkled with diamond jewelry. They hosted the reception at an exclusive waterfront country club, featuring towering floral centerpieces and a live jazz band. The caption beneath the photo read, "True love always wins the day." They married barely half a year after Julian walked out of my hospital room. I zoomed in on Savannah's confident, glowing face. She looked like a woman who had just claimed the ultimate prize. She firmly believed she stole a wealthy, successful tech founder. She paraded her new lifestyle for the entire city to witness, entirely oblivious to the fact that her lavish beachfront wedding was funded entirely by my stolen emergency savings. Julian did not build that wealth. I built it. He merely hijacked the accounts while I was trapped on a ventilator. A normal person might have shattered right there. A normal woman might have thrown the cheap prepaid phone against the cinder block wall, screaming into the sterile air of the rehab clinic. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. Hysteria is a chaotic, useless emotion. Hysteria warns your enemies that you are coming. Silence, however, is a lethal weapon. Silence makes them complacent. I closed the photo album and opened a web browser. I navigated to the state government legal portal. I downloaded a standard pro se petition for the dissolution of marriage. I filled out the digital forms using the clinic's slow public Wi-Fi. I checked the box indicating an uncontested divorce. I officially relinquished my claim to alimony, requested zero division of corporate assets, and asked for nothing but the legal severance of our names. I wanted Julian to think he had won. I needed him to believe his cruel strategy worked flawlessly. By filing an uncontested divorce and walking away empty-handed, I projected the exact image he expected: the sick, defeated ex-wife waving a white flag of total surrender. I printed the documents from the clinic's ancient communal printer. I carried the warm pages back to my bed and clicked a blue ballpoint pen. I signed the bottom line of the legal affidavit. I watched the ink flow onto the paper. I traced the letter E in Emmett with deliberate, flawless precision. I closed the loop of the letter tightly, ensuring the cursive script was perfectly seamless. Years ago, sitting at that cramped kitchen table, I taught Julian how to forge my signature to sign for his business packages. I purposely taught him a broken version, a disconnected lazy loop on the E. It was a stupid joke between young partners, a way to distinguish his fake signature from my authentic legal mark. Now that disconnected loop was the cornerstone of my impending retaliation. I mailed the crisp divorce papers to the Miami courthouse that afternoon, officially playing dead. To survive the upcoming months, I required baseline capital. My physical body was still broken, but my mind remained a steel trap. I accessed an online freelance marketplace from my phone. I began accepting low-level, anonymous data entry and back-end coding contracts. I worked through the night, typing complex algorithms with trembling fingers, hiding under the thin hospital blanket so the nurses would not confiscate my device. I hoarded every single dollar into a newly established, highly secure, digital bank account under my maiden name. The clinic grew quiet as midnight approached. The rhythmic hum of the floor buffer echoed down the long hallway. I submitted a completed data set to a client in Europe and rubbed my burning eyes. I prepared to turn off the phone and finally sleep. Suddenly, the screen illuminated with a sharp, unexpected notification. It was an automated email alert from a legacy credit monitoring service I set up in my 20s, an account I had nearly forgotten existed. The subject line glowed in stark white text against the dark screen. Urgent inquiry. Significant change to your credit profile detected. I sat up straight, my heart rate accelerating against my ribs. Julian had already drained the liquid cash from our joint accounts. There was nothing left in the standard ledgers to trigger a high-level financial alert. I tapped the notification, entering my security credentials with rapid, precise keystrokes. The portal loaded, displaying a newly generated credit report. My eyes scanned the dense financial data, searching for the anomaly. I found it buried in the property records section. A massive six-figure home equity line of credit had been officially approved and fully dispersed. The debt was tied directly to a small premarital residential property I owned outright in Orlando, a house I purchased years before I ever met Julian Cross. I checked the origination date of the loan. The digital timestamp hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The loan application was submitted, approved, and finalized during the exact 2-week window I was lying in a coma on life support. Julian did not just empty the checking accounts to fund his wedding. He dug his hands into my past, leveraging my exclusive premarital property to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars in illicit cash. He bound my name to a catastrophic debt while a machine was breathing for me. I stared at the glowing screen in the dark room. The theft went far deeper than a stolen savings account. Julian Cross had officially crossed the line from a cruel, abandoning husband into an active federal criminal. The unheated efficiency apartment smelled of damp drywall and cheap bleach. Central Florida winters rarely freeze, but the coastal humidity seeped through the poorly insulated walls, chilling my bones. I sat at a wobbly particle board desk I salvaged from a curb, wrapping a thin fleece blanket tightly around my shoulders. The glow of my refurbished laptop illuminated the dark room, casting sharp shadows across the peeling paint. I possessed $72 in my checking account, a healing spine, and an insatiable hunger for retribution. I clicked the mouse, navigating the encrypted digital archives of the county property appraiser. The automated credit alert I received at the rehabilitation clinic had burned a hole in my mind for 3 days. I needed hard, undeniable proof of Julian's financial theft. I needed to see the weapon he used to leverage my premarital Orlando house. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing standard consumer portals to directly query the lending institution's public filing system. I requested a digital copy of the home equity line of credit origination documents. The screen displayed a spinning gray wheel. Every second stretched into an eternity. The rhythmic tapping of rain against my single-pane window mirrored the rapid beating of my heart. The PDF file loaded. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon of the loan agreement. Julian had extracted $250,000 in liquid cash against the equity of a property I purchased 5 years before I even knew his name. He routed the funds through a secondary escrow account, washing the capital before transferring it into the operational budget of his logistics startup. He essentially stole $250,000 from my past to finance Savannah's luxury future. I scrolled down to the final page of the contract, searching for the ultimate betrayal, the authorization signature. There it was, stamped in stark black ink at the bottom of the digital document. I zoomed in, magnifying the cursive script until it filled the entire monitor. I studied the sharp angles and the fluid arcs. Then I found the fatal flaw. The capital E in Emmett featured a distinct, unmistakable, disconnected loop at the top apex. It was the exact, deliberate error I taught Julian at our cramped kitchen table years ago. The inside joke he used to sign for my courier packages. He submitted this legally binding document to a federally insured bank while a ventilator pumped oxygen into my lungs. He committed severe bank fraud and identity theft, assuming I would die before I could ever review my financial ledgers. My hand hovered over the trackpad. The logical, immediate reaction for any victim would be to call the local authorities. A standard person would print this document, walk into a police precinct, and file a police report. They would hire a discount civil attorney and drag the cheating husband into a messy, prolonged family court battle. I analyzed that path with cold, sterile logic. If I initiated a civil lawsuit now, Julian would hire a slick defense lawyer. He would claim he extracted the equity under profound distress to cover my mounting intensive care bills, despite canceling my insurance. Family court judges saw messy financial disputes every single day. The legal system might force him to repay a fraction of the stolen equity over a decade, but he would avoid prison time. He would keep his startup. He would keep Savannah. He would keep his freedom. A civil reprimand was a slap on the wrist. I demanded an execution. I right-clicked the PDF and downloaded the high-resolution file directly to an encrypted, offline, solid-state drive. I created a secure digital vault, locking the forged signature away behind military-grade cryptographic keys. I archived the evidence of his federal bank fraud. I would let him build his logistics empire on a foundation of stolen money. I would let him grow comfortable, arrogant, and highly leveraged. I would let the meat ripen before I finally sprang the trap. The grueling 7-year grind officially commenced that night. I transformed the freezing, cramped apartment into a sanctuary of relentless focus. I funneled the blistering heat of my betrayal directly into the cold, unforgiving logic of software development. I recognized that Julian's logistics firm operated in a highly volatile market. The supply chain industry suffered from severe inefficiencies, relying on outdated predictive models to route global shipments. If I could build an algorithm that optimized those routes in real time, I could control the very lifeblood of his industry. My physical recovery ran parallel to my digital ascent. During the day, I walked the cracked sidewalks of my neighborhood, forcing my atrophied muscles to rebuild their strength. I pushed through the searing nerve pain, treating every step as a deliberate march toward my vengeance. I fueled my body on cheap rice and canned beans, ensuring every spare dollar went toward upgrading my server capacity. I needed processing power, and I sacrificed every ounce of personal comfort to acquire it. When the sun set, the real work began. I sat in the dark, writing thousands of lines of complex code. I designed a revolutionary predictive analytics engine capable of processing terabytes of supply chain data in fractions of a second. The screen reflected in my eyes until dawn. My wrists burned with carpal tunnel, and my spine ached from the cheap particle board chair, but I never paused. The phantom echo of Julian's voice reading that cruel yellow sticky note served as my endless adrenaline supply. I did not socialize. I did not date. I did not waste a single hour on frivolous entertainment. I operated with the singular, terrifying dedication of an apex predator tracking its prey across a frozen tundra. 3 years into the grind, the architecture of my software reached structural perfection. I registered a limited liability company using an anonymous Delaware proxy service, naming it Veil Analytics. I launched a beta version of the software to a select group of mid-tier shipping companies. The results were immediate and staggering. My algorithm cut their operational overhead by 20% in the first quarter alone. Word spread through the logistics sector like wildfire. The initial trickle of subscription revenue rapidly transformed into a roaring flood of corporate capital. I funneled the profits directly back into the company, hiring elite developers, securing proprietary server farms, and ruthlessly expanding my market share. I moved out of the unheated apartment and established a secure, fortified command center in a sleek Miami high-rise. I intentionally structured Veil Analytics as a shadowy entity. I appointed a highly paid, fiercely loyal executive named Marcus to serve as the public face and proxy chief executive officer. Marcus attended the industry conferences, shook the hands of venture capitalists, and graced the covers of tech magazines under the banner of Apex Holdings, my parent's shell company. I remained entirely hidden behind the tinted glass of my penthouse office, pulling the strings of my rapidly expanding empire without ever exposing my true identity to the public. By year 5, Veil Analytics dominated the southeastern supply chain sector. By year 6, we were actively acquiring smaller competitors, absorbing their client lists, and starving the remaining holdouts. My personal wealth grew into the hundreds of millions, safely insulated within ironclad blind trusts. I navigated corporate mergers with the exact cold precision I used to navigate my physical rehabilitation. I had successfully forged myself into an untouchable titan of industry, but the hunger in my chest remained unsatisfied. The encrypted drive containing Julian's forged signature sat locked inside my wall safe, patiently waiting for its moment in the light. Year 7 arrived with a subtle yet profound shift in the corporate landscape. I sat at my expansive glass desk, reviewing the quarterly acquisition targets presented by my risk assessment team. Marcus sat across from me, handing over a thick portfolio of struggling logistics companies desperate for a buyout. I opened the heavy leather binder. My eyes scanned the executive summaries evaluating profit margins and operational deficits. Then, a specific corporate logo caught my attention. A familiar name printed in crisp black text on the glossy paper. Cross Logistics. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I traced the printed letters with my manicured finger. The company profile detailed a catastrophic financial reality. Julian and Savannah were bleeding cash, drowning in toxic debt, and actively soliciting a corporate bailout to avoid imminent bankruptcy. The empire they built using my stolen premarital equity was crumbling under the weight of their own incompetence. They had unknowingly placed their necks directly onto my chopping block. The 7-year wait was over. The hunt had officially begun. My morning routine operated with the precision of a synchronized vault. At 34 years old, my life contained 0 variables. The alarm chimed at 4 o'clock. I rose from the pristine white sheets of my Miami penthouse and stepped directly into a freezing shower. The icy water shocked my nervous system, a daily physical reminder that I was awake, alive, and entirely in control. The frail, broken woman who once withered in a Central Florida intensive care unit no longer existed. In her place stood the hidden architect of a corporate empire, forged in the fires of profound betrayal and hardened by 7 years of relentless isolation. I dried off and dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer and matching trousers. I walked into my private elevator and placed my thumb against the biometric scanner. A green light flashed, confirming my identity. The steel doors slid shut, descending from my residential floor down to the secure executive suites of Veil Analytics. I operated this multi-million-dollar software firm through a shadowy proxy shell called Apex Holdings. My true name never appeared on public tax documents, press releases, or networking brochures. I was a phantom, sitting at the apex of the southeastern supply chain sector. The elevator chimed, opening into a sprawling command center constructed of tinted glass and imported gray slate. Servers hummed quietly behind reinforced walls, processing millions of logistical data points every second. I walked to my corner office, which offered a panoramic view of Biscayne Bay. The sunrise painted the water in shades of bruised purple and gold. A gentle knock broke the silence. Marcus entered the room holding 2 cups of black coffee and a thick leather portfolio. Marcus was a seasoned corporate veteran in his late 50s. He possessed a sharp mind, an authoritative presence, and a deep, unshakable loyalty to me. He served as the public face of Apex Holdings, acting as the chief executive officer for every external-facing transaction. He shook hands with venture capitalists and gave interviews to financial networks, keeping the spotlight far away from my desk. "Good morning," Emmett Marcus said, setting a coffee cup near my keyboard. "The European markets closed exactly as your algorithm predicted. Our acquisition capital is flush, and the risk assessment team has prepared the quarterly target list." I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee, welcoming the burn in my throat. Show me who is bleeding. The modern tech sector was a vicious, unforgiving ecosystem. Startups often secured early funding based on charismatic pitches and inflated promises, only to burn through their runway within a few years. When their cash flow evaporated, they came crawling to conglomerates like Apex Holdings, begging for bailouts to avoid total bankruptcy. We absorbed their failing infrastructures, stripped their useful assets, and discarded the rest. It was a cold, mathematical process. Marcus opened the leather portfolio and spread 3 glossy folders across my desk. He tapped the first file. "This is a regional freight carrier out of Jacksonville. They over-leveraged their fleet of autonomous trucks. We can buy their routing contracts for pennies on the dollar and liquidate the vehicles." I barely glanced at the paper. Standard operational failure. Put them in the secondary queue. Who else? Marcus slid the second folder aside and placed his hand firmly on the third. "This one is urgent," he said, his tone shifting into serious professionalism. "They are a mid-tier logistics software firm based right here in Miami. They expanded far too fast during the last fiscal quarter. They signed leases on 3 coastal warehouses they cannot fill, and their burn rate is unsustainable. They are 90 days away from defaulting on their primary commercial loans." He pushed the folder toward the center of my desk. I looked down at the printed cover sheet. Cross Logistics. The logo featured a sharp, stylized arrow. Beneath the logo, the executive summary listed the names of the primary shareholders. Julian Cross, founder. Savannah Sterling, chief financial officer. My heart did not race. My hands did not tremble. The rigorous discipline I cultivated over the last 7 years held my physiological responses in a vice grip. I stared at the names printed in bold black ink. The universe possessed a dark, poetic rhythm. The man who forged my signature to steal my premarital home and the woman who funded her extravagant beachfront wedding with my stolen savings were now drowning in a self-inflicted financial crisis. "What is their current asking price?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Marcus let out a dry, cynical laugh. "That is the fascinating part. They are practically insolvent, yet their chief executive officer sent an incredibly demanding email to our acquisitions department last night. Julian Cross is asking for a $30 million buyout. He claims his proprietary routing algorithm is poised to revolutionize the southern shipping corridor. He insists Apex Holdings needs his technology to survive the next quarter." I traced the edge of the folder with my index finger. Julian remained exactly as I remembered him. He was a textbook narcissist, masking his profound incompetence with unearned bravado. He truly believed he held leverage while standing on a sinking ship. I opened the file and scanned the financial ledgers Marcus had procured. The numbers painted a vivid, pathetic story. Savannah, acting as the chief financial officer, had authorized exorbitant corporate expenditures. The ledger showed monthly payments for luxury vehicle leases, premium country club memberships, and highly questionable entertainment budgets, all disguised as standard operating costs. They had drained their venture capital to fund a facade of wealth, leaving the actual company hollow and rotting from the inside out. "They are desperate," Marcus noted, watching my face carefully. "If we wait 3 months, they will file for Chapter 11 protection. We can purchase their client list during the bankruptcy auction for a fraction of their current asking price. Engaging them now seems counterproductive." I closed the folder, aligning the edges perfectly with the corner of my desk. "If we wait for bankruptcy court, a judge will freeze their assets and restructure their debt," I explained, looking out at the morning sun reflecting off the ocean. They will walk away with protected personal wealth. I do not want them to file for bankruptcy, Marcus. I want to buy them." Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my departure from our usual predatory patience. "You want to pay $30 million for a toxic asset? I want to initiate a formal acquisition process." I corrected my tone, sharpening into a lethal edge. "I want Julian Cross to believe he has successfully manipulated us. I want him to think Apex Holdings is desperate for his software. We are going to offer him a lifeline, but we will weave that lifeline out of razor wire." I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The pieces of the chessboard were aligning with terrifying precision. I turned back to my proxy executive. "Send a formal response to his email. Tell him Apex Holdings is highly intrigued by his initial pitch. Tell him our board of directors views his algorithm as a critical missing piece for our upcoming regional expansion. Flatter his ego. Feed his delusions of grandeur." Marcus nodded slowly, pulling a silver pen from his pocket to jot down my instructions. He thrives on validation. "I will draft the response to sound hungry. When do you want to schedule the preliminary meeting?" "Tell him we operate on an expedited timeline," I instructed, pacing slowly across the slate floor. "Invite him to our headquarters this Thursday. Inform him that he will be pitching directly to the executive leadership team. Make sure he understands this is a closed-door, highly confidential negotiation." "Will you be monitoring the pitch from the secure feed?" Marcus asked, assuming I would maintain my usual shadow protocol. I shook my head, a cold, calculated smile touching the corners of my mouth. "Not this time. Julian Cross believes he is walking into a room with a gullible corporate entity. He thinks he is going to negotiate a golden parachute to save his extravagant lifestyle. I want him in our primary boardroom. I want the temperature lowered to 65 degrees. I want a single chair placed on his side of the table." Marcus paused, his pen hovering over his notepad. He sensed the unspoken gravity of my directives. The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted, growing dense with impending consequence. "And Marcus," I added, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous register, "do not disclose my name on the visitor registry. Let the receptionist direct him to the executive suite under the Apex umbrella. When the heavy doors of that boardroom swing open, I want to be the one sitting in the chief executive chair." Marcus closed his notepad, a glint of professional admiration shining in his eyes. He recognized a flawless ambush when he saw one. "I will send the invitation immediately," he replied, turning toward the office door. I stood alone in the silent expanse of my penthouse, listening to the soft click of the door latching shut. The digital clock on my wall shifted to 6 a.m. 7 years of grueling physical therapy, sleepless nights writing code, and endless strategic maneuvering had all led to this exact moment. Julian and Savannah thought they buried a sick, helpless victim in that Central Florida hospital. They were about to discover that they had actually planted a seed, and the harvest was going to cost them everything they owned. I am Emmett Vale, and Thursday morning brought a suffocating layer of coastal humidity to the city. I sat inside the fortified server room of our headquarters, surrounded by the quiet hum of cooling fans. 3 high-resolution monitors illuminated my face in the dim light. I had adjusted my initial strategy. Revealing my identity too early would trigger Julian's survival instincts. He would run before signing any binding documents. To trap a narcissist, you must construct a cage made of their own ego. Marcus would handle this preliminary negotiation. I would remain the invisible architect, whispering directives through a secure micro earpiece. The primary monitor displayed a live feed of the glass lobby on the ground floor. The revolving doors spun, and Julian stepped into the building. My heart maintained a steady, resting rhythm. I observed him with the clinical detachment of a scientist studying a pathogen. He wore a tailored suit, but the fabric hung loosely on his frame, suggesting recent stress-induced weight loss. He approached the reception desk. He did not offer a polite greeting to the administrative assistant. He snapped his fingers, demanding immediate attention, loudly stating he had a private audience with the executive team. His outward arrogance remained intact, but his subtle physical tells betrayed his profound panic. He wiped his palms on his trousers twice in less than a minute. He compulsively checked his watch, desperate for salvation. "Send him up," I murmured into my headset microphone. Marcus stood inside the primary boardroom on the executive floor. He tapped his left ear, confirming he received my audio feed. I had instructed the facilities team to lower the ambient temperature of the room to a frigid 60 degrees. Discomfort breeds compliance. The heavy oak doors opened. Julian walked into the boardroom, his eyes darting across the expansive gray slate table. Marcus stepped forward, offering a firm, practiced handshake. Julian grasped his hand, puffing out his chest to project dominance. "Welcome to Apex Holdings," Marcus said smoothly, gesturing to the single chair positioned on the far side of the table. "We appreciate you making the time for this expedited meeting." Julian unbuttoned his suit jacket and sat down, leaning back to feign a relaxed posture. "When a conglomerate like yours calls a smart founder makes time," Julian replied, his tone dripping with unearned superiority. "But I want to be clear. Cross Logistics is currently fielding multiple acquisition offers. My software is highly sought after. I am only here because I respect your regional footprint." I watched his performance on the secondary monitor. His bluff was pathetic. His company possessed 0 alternative offers. They were drowning in toxic debt and 90 days from default. I leaned toward my microphone. "Feed him the bait," I instructed Marcus. "Show him weakness." Marcus adjusted his posture, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "We value transparency at Apex Holdings," Marcus began, keeping his voice low and serious. "We did not invite you here for a casual networking session. Our third quarter projections are facing a severe downward trend. Our current supply chain routing algorithm is failing to handle the increased cargo volume in the southern corridor. We are hemorrhaging operational capital." I watched Julian on the screen. The tension in his shoulders instantly evaporated. His eyes widened slightly before narrowing into a calculating squint. The lie was sinking in. He believed the towering conglomerate was bleeding, and he held the only tourniquet. "Our board of directors is demanding an immediate technological solution before the next shareholder meeting." Marcus continued playing the role of a desperate executive flawlessly. "Your proprietary routing software could bridge our operational gap. We need your infrastructure, Julian. We need it to finalize our regional expansion. If we do not acquire a functional algorithm by the end of the month, heads will roll in this office." The psychological shift in the boardroom was palpable. Julian sat taller in his chair. He crossed his right leg over his left knee, a universal physical signal of perceived dominance. His breathing slowed. The nervous sweat on his forehead seemed to dry up. He thought he possessed the upper hand. He assumed he was walking into a negotiation where the buyer was more desperate than the seller. "That is a precarious position for a major holding company," Julian said, shaking his head with a mock display of sympathy. "The tech sector moves fast. If you rely on outdated legacy systems, you get left behind. My algorithm is light years ahead of your current capabilities. It optimizes freight routes in real time, factoring in weather patterns and port congestion. It is the lifeblood of modern logistics." He was reciting lines directly from his marketing brochure, padding his worth with meaningless buzzwords. His software was average at best, built on outdated code architecture Savannah likely sourced from cheap offshore developers. But Marcus nodded along, projecting deep admiration. "We are prepared to offer a highly lucrative buyout," Marcus stated, pulling a pristine white folder from his leather briefcase. "We want to absorb Cross Logistics entirely. We are willing to meet your $30 million asking price. However, due to our internal quarterly deadlines, we require this acquisition to be finalized by next week." Julian tried to hide his overwhelming relief, but his jaw clenched tight. $30 million would wipe out his crippling commercial loans, fund Savannah's extravagant lifestyle, and leave him with millions in clean, liquid cash. He thought he was executing the heist of the century. He thought he was tricking Apex Holdings into buying a hollow shell while he parachuted away with a fortune. $30 million is the baseline, Julian countered, attempting to squeeze out a final drop of authority. But considering your urgent timeline and your failing third quarter numbers, I think it is a fair starting point. I am willing to proceed to the due diligence phase. "Set the hook," I whispered into the microphone. "We need immediate access to your digital data room," Marcus replied, sliding a single sheet of paper across the slate table. "This is a preliminary non-disclosure agreement. Once you sign this, you will provide our forensic team with read-only access to your internal financial ledgers and operational code. We need to verify your asset valuation before we draft the final binding contracts." Julian did not hesitate. His unchecked arrogance blinded him to any standard legal precautions. He did not ask to consult his attorneys. He did not read the fine print of the non-disclosure agreement. He saw a $30 million escape hatch and lunged for it. He pulled his silver pen from his breast pocket and scribbled his signature across the bottom of the page. "I will authorize the digital handshake from my phone right now," Julian boasted, tapping the screen of his device. "Your tech guys can look under the hood all they want. You will find that Cross Logistics operates with flawless precision." I stared at the primary monitor in my secure server room. A new window popped open on my desktop. The encrypted firewall guarding Cross Logistics' internal servers verified the digital handshake. I now possessed total, unrestricted access to every single financial transaction, every hidden email, and every buried secret Julian and Savannah tried to conceal. Julian stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a renewed sense of arrogant pride. He offered Marcus another firm handshake. "Have your lawyers draft the final acquisition papers," Julian commanded, acting as though he owned the building. "I will review them this weekend." "We look forward to a very profitable partnership," Marcus replied, his tone smooth and professional. As Julian walked out of the boardroom and headed toward the elevators, I turned my attention away from the security feed. I dragged my mouse across the screen and opened the master financial ledger for Cross Logistics. The raw data began to populate my monitor in endless rows of green text. Julian believed he had just tricked a desperate corporation into absorbing his bad debt. He thought the due diligence process was merely a formality. He was wrong. I initiated a deep forensic scan, cross-referencing his operational expenses against his declared revenue. The algorithm combed through years of banking data in a matter of seconds. I was searching for the mundane signs of corporate mismanagement. Instead, a series of recurring, highly obfuscated wire transfers triggered a severe security alert on my dashboard. The numbers did not just represent a failing business model. They pointed directly toward a vast, ongoing criminal enterprise. The trap I set for a greedy ex-husband was about to catch a federal fugitive. The glowing green rows of data cascaded down my primary monitor like digital rain. The digital handshake Julian authorized in the boardroom provided my servers with an unrestricted key to his entire corporate kingdom. I sat alone in the fortified control room, watching the algorithm dissect 7 years of his financial history. At first glance, the ledgers told a simple, pathetic story of incompetence. Cross Logistics bled capital through standard mismanagement. They overpaid for warehouse space. They leased luxury vehicles for executives. They burned through their Series A funding with reckless disregard for consequence. But a forensic data analyst does not stop at the surface layer. I programmed my software to hunt for obfuscation. I instructed the system to ignore the primary balance sheets and trace the raw, unedited metadata attached to every outgoing wire transfer. If Julian and Savannah were desperate enough to beg Apex Holdings for a buyout, their internal math had to be missing a crucial variable. The cooling fans in the server racks hummed a steady, hypnotic tune. I leaned closer to the screen. A sudden red flag illuminated the dark display. The automated tracking system isolated a recurring anomaly. Every fiscal quarter, a specific bundle of corporate capital bypassed the standard payroll and vendor accounts. Instead, these funds routed through an encrypted payment gateway, bouncing across 3 different digital nodes before vanishing into a holding account. I typed a new command, deploying a specialized penetration script to follow that vanished money. The script cracked the gateway routing numbers in less than a minute. The hidden destination materialized on my screen. It was not a vendor. It was a holding trust registered under a generic alphanumeric name. I pulled the corporate registration records for the state of Florida. The trust belonged to a web of 3 limited liability companies. All three entities listed their primary business operation as commercial real estate acquisition. Their registered addresses trace back to a vacant strip mall in a desolate corner of Miami. Julian was not just failing at logistics, he was actively looting his own investors. I cross-referenced the real estate shell companies with the outgoing wire transfers from Cross Logistics. The pattern emerged with terrifying clarity. Julian and his chief financial officer were generating fictitious invoices for phantom software development and non-existent logistical hardware. They funneled the venture capital out of the tech startup and pumped it directly into the real estate shells. Once the stolen funds washed through the dummy corporations, they purchased high-end residential properties, luxury yacht leases, and offshore equity funds. They were running a textbook embezzlement operation, using the logistics firm as a hollow front to finance an extravagant lifestyle they could never legitimately afford. I commanded the software to calculate the total sum of the illicit transfers over the past 36 months. The progress bar loaded rapidly. The final number flashed across the center of my monitor. $50 million. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer scale of the theft. The stakes shifted instantly. An hour ago, I planned to orchestrate a severe corporate bankruptcy, stripping Julian of his unearned wealth and leaving him destitute. Now the battlefield expanded into federal territory. Embezzling $50 million in investor capital constituted severe wire fraud, tax evasion, and systemic money laundering. The United States government handed out decades in maximum security federal penitentiaries for a fraction of those crimes. I opened the signature logs attached to the fraudulent wire transfers. Every single illicit transaction bore the digital authorization stamp of the chief financial officer, Savannah Sterling. A brief profile of her character snapped into focus. During the early days of Julian's startup, Savannah possessed a reputation as an ambitious junior account manager who understood how to exploit accounting loopholes. She constantly sought shortcuts to power. When Julian left me in the intensive care unit, his narcissism met her insatiable greed. She clearly recognized his fragile ego and manipulated his desire to be a tech titan. She orchestrated the dummy corporations, convincing him that real billionaires hid their wealth in real estate shells. She drove the operation, transforming a careless tech founder into a prolific federal felon. They believed their crimes were buried beneath layers of impenetrable corporate armor. They assumed the due diligence process for an acquisition only involved reviewing the polished, sanitized balance sheets they presented to the board of directors. Their arrogance shielded them from the reality that digital ink never truly dries. Every stolen dollar left a permanent, verifiable footprint. A cold, profound satisfaction settled deep into my bones. The trap required a strategic upgrade. I could not simply expose the fraud and walk away. If I handed this data to the authorities right now, Julian and Savannah would hire elite defense attorneys. They would claim ignorance, blame rogue employees, and drag the investigation out for years through endless legal appeals. I needed them to claim ownership of the debt. I needed them to legally verify the fraudulent ledgers under penalty of perjury. If I drafted an acquisition contract containing a total liability transfer and Julian signed it, he would bind his personal identity to the stolen $50 million. He would hand the federal government an airtight confession. To draft a contract that lethal, I needed to observe their current psychological baseline. I needed to know if the pressure of their impending ruin was causing them to crack or if they still believed they were untouchable kings of the Miami social scene. I closed the forensic software and opened my secure email terminal. A calendar notification alerted me to an upcoming high-profile event. The annual Biscayne Bay Marine Conservation Charity Gala was scheduled for this Saturday night. The guest list featured the wealthiest tech founders, real estate developers, and venture capitalists in South Florida. I scanned the digital roster of platinum sponsors. Cross Logistics occupied a premier spot on the list. Julian and Savannah were spending stolen investor capital to secure VIP tables at a charity event, desperately maintaining their facade of endless wealth. My eyes drifted further down the page to the gala hosting committee. A familiar name jumped out from the screen: Harper Cross. Harper was Julian's older sister. She was a Caucasian socialite who spent her entire adult life coasting on family connections and inherited privilege. When I was grinding through data analytics to pay her brother's rent, Harper treated me like hired help. When Julian abandoned me in the hospital, Harper applauded the decision, claiming her brother deserved a wife who could match his elite trajectory. She actively enabled his abuse, benefiting directly from the stolen funds he funneled into her social vanity projects. Attending that gala meant stepping out of the shadows. It meant placing myself in the same room as the parasites who tried to erase my existence. If I attended under my anonymous consulting alias, I could study their hubris up close. I could watch them drink expensive champagne paid for with stolen money. I could read their body language and fine-tune the psychological exactness of the liability transfer contract. I picked up the secure phone on my desk and dialed my personal assistant. The line connected immediately. "Clear my schedule for Saturday evening," I instructed, my voice sharp and decisive. "Procure a VIP ticket to the Biscayne Bay Charity Gala. Register the ticket under an independent tech consultant alias. Have the styling team prepare a formal gown. Ensure it projects quiet wealth. I need to blend into the room while I observe a specific target." "Understood," my assistant replied. "The arrangements will be finalized within the hour." I placed the phone back on the receiver and looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the sprawling Miami skyline. The sun beat down on the glittering glass towers. Julian, Savannah, and Harper were out there, breathing the ocean air, oblivious to the digital guillotine suspended directly over their heads. They thought they had secured a $30 million lifeline. They had no idea they had just handed me the rope to execute their entire lineage. The real game was about to begin on their own territory. The grand ballroom of the Biscayne Bay Country Club smelled of roasted sea bass, expensive gardenias, and desperation. I stood near a towering ice sculpture, observing the elite tier of the Miami financial sector. The room buzzed with the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low murmur of venture capitalists hunting for their next lucrative acquisition. I wore a tailored midnight blue silk gown that draped flawlessly over my frame. The high neckline concealed the faint, lingering surgical scars on my collarbone. I held a glass of sparkling water, feeling the cool condensation against my palm. My heart maintained a steady, resting rhythm of 60 beats per minute. I belonged in this room of predators, but nobody here knew my true name or the silent empire I commanded from the shadows. I scanned the crowded dance floor and located my targets. Julian and Savannah stood near the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of older, wealthy investors. Julian wore a velvet dinner jacket, laughing too loud at a joke someone else made. He held a glass of dark liquor, projecting the image of a thriving tech founder. Savannah clung to his arm in a tight silver dress, scanning the crowd with hungry, calculating eyes. They looked like royalty. They were actually drowning in $50 million of stolen debt. I kept my distance. Engaging them tonight was premature. I needed to observe their psychological state under the pressure of their impending financial collapse. A sharp, shrill voice cut through the smooth jazz playing from the stage. "Well, look what the tide dragged in." I turned slowly, keeping my expression entirely neutral. Harper Cross marched toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. She was Julian's older sister, a 42-year-old Caucasian socialite who spent her entire adult life treating inherited privilege as a personal achievement. She wore an emerald sequin dress that pinched her ribs, and she gripped a martini glass so tightly her knuckles shone white. Harper possessed a long documented history of enabling her brother. When I was trapped in the intensive care unit 7 years ago, Harper visited the hospital exactly once. She did not bring flowers or offer comfort. She stood at the foot of my bed complaining about the exorbitant cost of the visitor parking garage. I distinctly remembered hearing her whisper to Julian in the hallway, warning him that medical debt ruined credit scores and advising him to cut the dead weight before my illness dragged down his career. She applauded my abandonment. She thrived on cruelty. Harper did not approach me alone. She deliberately flanked herself with 3 prominent local venture capitalists men who managed millions in tech portfolios. She wanted an audience for my humiliation. Emmett Vale Harper said, stopping inches from my personal space. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a condescending sneer. I am shocked the security team let you pass the velvet ropes. Did you sneak in through the catering kitchen? I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. It is a charity gala, Harper. The tickets are available to anyone willing to write the check. Harper let out a harsh, theatrical laugh, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. She turned to the 3 venture capitalists standing beside her, eager to perform. Gentlemen, allow me to introduce my brother's starter wife. Emmett got sick a few years ago and just gave up on her career. She has been harboring a bitter grudge ever since Julian moved on to build a real life. The 3 investors offered me tight, uncomfortable nods. They did not want to be involved in a domestic dispute, but Harper was a known social connector, so they remained a captive audience. Harper turned her attention back to me, her eyes gleaming with toxic delight. You really should not be here, Emmett. It is embarrassing. Julian and Savannah are the guests of honor tonight. My brother is a logistics visionary. Cross Logistics is generating unprecedented revenue. They just secured a secondary waterfront estate in South Beach, and Savannah is leasing a private yacht for their upcoming corporate retreat. You are standing in the presence of true titans, and you look like a lost tourist. She took a victorious sip of her martini. She thought she had delivered a crushing blow. She expected me to shrink, to stammer, or to run crying toward the exit. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of my perceived failure. Dramatic irony is a beautiful, lethal weapon. Harper stood in front of 3 men who analyzed financial risk for a living, boasting loudly about her brother's real estate purchases and luxury yacht leases. She firmly believed she was bragging about his brilliant business acumen. I knew the objective truth. I knew Julian funded that South Beach estate and that yacht lease by generating fictitious invoices and funneling $50 million of venture capital through dummy corporations. She was publicly confessing to his federal wire fraud, and she was entirely too arrogant to realize it. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her hysterical, breathless energy. I lowered my water glass and looked directly into her eyes, utilizing the cold, sterile logic of mathematics to dismantle her entire reality. That is an incredibly fascinating financial strategy, I said, my voice carrying a crisp, authoritative edge that caused the 3 venture capitalists to suddenly pay close attention. Harper frowned, confused by my lack of emotional distress. What are you talking about? I shifted my gaze to the investors, addressing them as peers. A proprietary logistics algorithm requires heavy server maintenance, constant code optimization, and a massive developer payroll. If a tech founder is generating unprecedented revenue, that capital must be reinvested directly into the digital infrastructure to maintain market dominance. I turned back to Harper, tilting my head slightly. You just announced that Julian is diverting his operational capital into luxury yacht leases and South Beach residential real estate. Waterfront estates in that specific zip code require a staggering debt-to-income ratio. If a logistics firm has a burn rate exceeding their Series A funding, diverting cash to luxury real estate does not signify visionary success. It signifies a severe liquidity crisis. The air around our table grew noticeably colder. The 3 venture capitalists narrowed their eyes, their predatory instincts kicking in. They mentally calculated the math I just presented. In the tech sector, flashing unearned wealth was a giant, glaring red flag, indicating internal rot. Harper felt the power dynamic shifting. A dark flush of color crept up her neck. She gripped her martini glass tighter, her confidence fracturing. You do not know anything about corporate finance, Emmett. You are just jealous. In this specific industry, I continued ignoring her petty insult and delivering the final, fatal assessment. When chief executives prioritize purchasing yachts over expanding their server capacity, they are usually preparing for imminent insolvency or a federal audit. Intelligent investors know the difference between a thriving tech firm and a hollow shell company bleeding cash to fund a vanity project. The silence that followed was deafening. The three investors looked at Harper with undisguised caution, physically stepping back to distance themselves from her toxic boasting. They made mental notes to heavily scrutinize Cross Logistics. Harper stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. I had not insulted her dress or called her names. I simply used basic financial mathematics to publicly expose the rotting foundation of her brother's empire, and I did it in front of the exact people Julian desperately needed to impress. I did not wait for her to formulate a response. I offered the gentleman a polite nod and walked gracefully away, leaving Harper drowning in her own engineered humiliation. I navigated through the crowded ballroom, heading toward the quiet sanctuary of the outdoor terrace. The cool ocean breeze washed over my face, carrying the scent of salt water. The encounter confirmed my hypothesis. Julian and his enablers were still blinded by their own narcissism. They were ripe for the slaughter. As I stepped into the shadows of the terrace, my secure phone vibrated against my thigh. I pulled the device from my silk clutch. The screen illuminated the darkness. It was an encrypted text message from my lead forensic data engineer. The notification contained only 2 sentences, but they carried the weight of an execution order. The encryption on Julian's offshore bank accounts has been broken. We have the routing numbers for the stolen $50 million. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my purse. The final piece of evidence was secure. The trap was fully constructed. It was time to draft a contract that Julian Cross could not survive. The ocean air clinging to my silk gown faded the second I stepped into the climate-controlled sanctuary of my penthouse server room. I traded the glittering ballroom for a windowless vault lined with humming processor racks and tangled Ethernet cables. The scent of expensive gardenias vanished, replaced by the sterile tang of ozone and chilled recycled air. I unclasped the heavy diamond necklace from my throat, letting the jewels clatter onto my glass desk. The charity gala served its purpose. I had observed the prey. I confirmed their psychological fragility. Now it was time to construct the execution chamber. I sat in my ergonomic leather chair and woke the primary monitors. The encrypted files my forensic data engineer intercepted from the offshore accounts waited on the desktop. I opened the digital ledger. The numbers painted a vivid portrait of unbridled greed. Savannah Sterling possessed expensive tastes and zero restraint. I scrolled through the itemized wire transfers. $200,000 vanished into a luxury yacht lease. $4 million evaporated into a down payment for a South Beach waterfront estate. The stolen investor capital flowed like a river out of the tech startup and straight into the pockets of the executives who were supposed to steward it. In standard corporate America, the limited liability shield protects founders from personal ruin when a company fails. If Cross Logistics simply filed for bankruptcy, a judge would liquidate the servers and the office furniture, but Julian and Savannah would keep their offshore millions. The corporate veil acted as an impenetrable fortress against civil litigation. I needed to pierce that veil. I needed Julian to willingly dissolve his own armor. I opened a blank legal template on my secondary monitor. My fingers drifted over the mechanical keyboard. Before the betrayal, I spent countless hours reviewing vendor contracts and software licensing agreements for his early startup. I understood the dense, esoteric language of corporate law. I began drafting a highly specialized letter of intent for the acquisition of Cross Logistics. The first 3 pages read like a standard, highly lucrative buyout offer. I proposed a $30 million purchase price, structuring the deal to look incredibly appealing to a desperate founder. I included generous severance packages for the dummy board of directors and a smooth transition timeline. It looked exactly like the desperate lifeline my proxy executive had promised during the initial boardroom pitch. It was the perfect bait, wrapped in gleaming financial promises. Then I reached page 4. I began embedding the poison pills. I typed out Clause 4B, the total liability transfer. I crafted the legal jargon with surgical precision. The clause explicitly stated that by accepting the acquisition funds, the signing executive personally verified the accuracy of all past financial disclosures under penalty of perjury. Furthermore, the signer agreed to waive all corporate immunity regarding pre-existing debt. If any discrepancies emerged in the financial ledgers post-acquisition, the personal assets of the founders would be immediately seized to cover the deficit. I read the paragraph twice to ensure the wording was watertight. If Julian signed this document, he would legally bind his own Social Security number to the $50 million he embezzled. He would step out from behind the corporate veil and place his neck directly on the chopping block. But a confession meant nothing without an executioner. I needed a mechanism to alert the authorities the exact second the ink dried. I moved down the page and drafted Clause 7C, the mandatory federal compliance audit. I disguised the trigger as a routine administrative protocol required by Apex Holdings for all regional acquisitions. The clause mandated that upon the execution of the contract, an automated, unredacted copy of the company financial history would be instantly transmitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service for standard compliance verification. Julian was hiding severe tax evasion and wire fraud. Submitting those specific ledgers to federal regulators was the equivalent of walking into a police station and handing the desk sergeant a loaded weapon used in a robbery. The clause functioned as an inescapable tripwire. The moment he agreed to the terms, the government would descend upon him. I finalized the document, embedding the text into a secure PDF format. I attached the letter of intent to an encrypted email and addressed it to the general counsel representing Cross Logistics. I hovered my finger over the enter key. Sending this contract shifted the game from a silent investigation into an active, lethal engagement. I pressed down. The email vanished into the digital ether. I did not leave the server room. I leaned back in my chair and pulled up a secondary terminal. During the initial digital handshake in our boardroom, my software had established a silent back door into the internal communication network of his logistics firm. I possessed real-time viewing access to their corporate email server. I wanted to watch the poison work its way through their system. 15 minutes later, the letter of intent landed in the inbox of his lead corporate attorney. I monitored the lawyer opening the file. I watched the cursor highlight the generous purchase price. Then I watched the cursor stall on page 4. The attorney recognized the danger immediately. A flurry of internal messages began routing through the server. The lawyer drafted an urgent email to Julian, attaching the contract and highlighting the liability transfer clause in bright red text. The lawyer warned Julian that the terms were highly irregular. He advised that waiving corporate immunity was corporate suicide. He explicitly instructed his client to reject the offer and demand a standard acquisition agreement, noting that Apex Holdings was overstepping standard legal boundaries. I held my breath, waiting for his response. To understand Julian Cross is to understand the fatal flaw of unchecked hubris. He viewed attorneys the same way he viewed accountants and software developers. He saw them as subservient obstacles, pessimistic employees who lacked his grand visionary insight. Julian firmly believed he was the smartest person in any room. 10 minutes later, his reply populated on my screen. It contained exactly 3 sentences. Apex is bleeding cash and desperate for our routing algorithm. Do not kill a $30 million deal over boilerplate administrative paranoia. Prepare the final documents for signing. I let out a slow, steady exhale. The tension in my shoulders released. The red herring had performed flawlessly. Julian was so blinded by his own greed and his false belief that he held the upper hand, he intentionally ignored the blaring alarms of his own legal counsel. He was so eager to offload a radioactive, failing company onto a gullible buyer that he refused to read the fine print of his own execution order. He believed he was swindling a conglomerate. The lawyer sent a reluctant confirmation email agreeing to draft the final signature pages without any revisions to the liability or compliance clauses. The trap was set. The jaws were locked wide open, waiting for the prey to step onto the pressure plate. I closed the email terminal and checked my calendar. The final signing ceremony was scheduled for the upcoming Thursday. I had 5 days to prepare the physical boardroom for the ultimate confrontation. I needed to orchestrate every visual detail to maximize the psychological shock of my identity reveal. A sudden ping from my secure messaging app broke the silence. Marcus, my proxy executive, sent a calendar update regarding the signing ceremony. I opened the notification. The legal team had submitted the final attendee list for the Thursday meeting. Julian was at the top, listed as the Chief Executive Officer. But a new variable had been added to the registry just moments ago. Savannah Sterling had officially inserted herself into the negotiations. She listed her title as Chief Financial Officer, demanding a seat at the table for the final contract execution. Savannah was not content to wait in her South Beach estate for the stolen money to clear. Her insatiable hunger for the spotlight drove her to demand a front-row seat to her perceived victory. She wanted to look the buyers in the eye and revel in her triumph. I stared at her name on the glowing screen. A cold smile touched my lips. I had originally planned to ruin Savannah from afar, letting the federal agents drag her out of her waterfront mansion. But her own vanity was delivering her directly into my hands. She was marching willingly into the high-rise, eager to secure a fortune built on my forged signature. She had no idea she was scheduling an appointment with the very ghost she helped create. The boardroom was about to become very crowded, and the falling blade would not miss a single neck. The humid evening air hung heavy over the rooftop lounge in downtown Miami. The space catered to mid-tier software developers and independent contractors hunting for seed money. I attended the mixer operating strictly under my consulting alias, blending into the background wearing a plain beige trench coat and dark slacks. I sipped a generic club soda, observing the desperate networking rituals from a quiet corner near the glass balcony railing. The neon lights from the surrounding skyscrapers reflected off the dark water of the bay, painting the night in sharp, artificial colors. The crisp clicking of stiletto heels approached from behind. The distinct, overwhelming scent of imported jasmine perfume pierced the salty ocean breeze. I did not need to turn around to identify the intruder. Savannah Sterling had tracked me down. After our brief proximity at the charity gala, she clearly utilized her social connections to uncover my public schedule. She sought me out deliberately. Savannah walked toward me holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. She wore a tight crimson dress designed to draw maximum attention. Her chin tilted upward, projecting an unearned sense of superiority. She viewed me as a pathetic relic from her husband's past, a discarded starter wife scraping by on freelance coding jobs. She wanted to exert dominance before her impending payday. "Emmett," she said, her tone dripping with venomous pity, "I am surprised to see you at an event like this, still hustling for those tiny freelance contracts." I turned slowly, resting my forearms against the cool metal of the railing. I offered a polite, subdued nod, playing the exact role she assigned me. "We all have to pay the rent, Savannah." Savannah spent her entire youth in a bleak, landlocked suburb, watching reality television and resenting her modest surroundings. She never possessed the intellect to build a genuine career. Instead, she treated corporate environments as hunting grounds, searching for vulnerable men with promising trajectories. Julian was her ultimate stepping stone. She manipulated his fragile ego, convincing him she was the visionary partner he deserved. She took a slow, theatrical sip of her drink. Her eyes scanned my simple attire with evident disgust. "Some of us do more than just pay rent," she boasted, stepping closer so her jasmine perfume suffocated my breathing space. "Julian and I are finalizing a monumental acquisition this week. Apex Holdings is buying our logistics firm for $30 million. We just put a cash deposit down on a pristine beachfront estate in South Beach. It features a private dock for the yacht." She expected me to crumble. She wanted to see envy fracture my composure. I maintained unblinking eye contact, letting a subtle, calculated expression of confusion wash over my face. $30 million is a staggering valuation, I replied, keeping my voice soft and hesitant. Building the initial infrastructure for a logistics firm requires intense seed capital. Julian barely had a savings account when we lived in Orlando. Securing that kind of leverage takes brilliant financial maneuvering. That specific compliment targeted her deepest psychological vulnerability. Savannah craved validation. She desperately needed the world to recognize her as the brilliant mastermind behind their wealth. She could not stand the idea that Julian received all the credit for their rapid ascent. Savannah leaned in close, closing the physical distance between us. The alcohol and the impending wealth intoxicated her judgment. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across her face. "Julian is a great salesman," she whispered, her voice layered with smug satisfaction. But he lacked the stomach for real risk. I had to show him how to secure our seed capital. I tilted my head, feigning genuine curiosity. Venture capitalists rarely fund empty proposals without heavy collateral. Savannah laughed a sharp, grating sound that echoed over the ambient lounge music. "We did not need venture capitalists, Emmett. We had you." She took another sip of champagne, her eyes gleaming with dark delight. "When your immune system crashed, Julian panicked. He wanted to sell his car to pay your intensive care bills. I told him that was a pathetic waste of resources. I showed him how to leverage the equity in your premarital house." My right hand rested casually inside the deep pocket of my trench coat. My fingers brushed against the smooth glass face of my customized smartphone. The device was actively recording the conversation in high-definition audio. "The bank required a signature," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "And Julian knew exactly how to copy yours." Savannah sneered, her vanity overriding any remaining shred of self-preservation. "We sat in his office while you were snoring on a ventilator across town. He traced your name on the home equity application, and I notarized the document myself using a fabricated seal. We pulled $250,000 out of your property in 3 days. We used the sick wife's money to build our empire, and you were too naive to ever notice." The confession was flawless. She admitted to conspiracy, bank fraud, and forgery, boasting about the specific timeline and the exact origin of the stolen capital. She handed me the ultimate weapon wrapped in a neat, venomous bow. Savannah stepped back, admiring her own cruelty. "Enjoy your club soda, Emmett. Try not to choke on our success." She turned on her crimson stilettos and strutted away, disappearing into the crowd of desperate networkers. I pulled the smartphone from my pocket. The recording application displayed a solid green circle, indicating a successful capture. I tapped the screen once. The pristine audio file encrypted instantly and transmitted through a secure tunnel directly to my offline server vault. The evidence was secured. The trap possessed razor-sharp teeth. I prepared to leave the rooftop lounge when a sudden vibration buzzed against my palm. I opened a newly arrived encrypted message from Marcus. The text glowed stark white against the dark screen. The message read, "Julian's commercial creditors filed an emergency injunction this evening. His primary lender is threatening to freeze his operating accounts by Friday. Julian just called my direct line in a state of sheer panic. He is demanding we expedite the signing ceremony. He wants to execute the contract tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. The timeline instantly collapsed. I originally planned to finalize my preparations over the next 5 days. Now, the execution required immediate, flawless acceleration. The boardroom needed to be set. The federal tripwires required final authorization. I walked out of the neon-lit lounge and into the humid Miami night. The final countdown had officially begun. Thursday morning broke over Miami with a harsh, glaring brilliance. The relentless Florida sun reflected off the tinted glass facade of the Apex Holdings Tower, casting long, sharp shadows across the downtown streets. I arrived at the penthouse 3 hours before the scheduled signing ceremony. The final execution required an immaculate stage. I dismissed my entire executive staff for the morning, instructing the security detail to lock down the top floor. The corridors stood silent, lined with imported dark slate and illuminated by minimalist recessed lighting. I wanted the environment to feel sterile, imposing, and devoid of any human warmth. I walked into the primary boardroom and stood at the head of the long table. I adjusted the climate control terminal on the wall, dropping the ambient temperature to a frigid 58 degrees. The chilled air immediately bit into my skin, but I welcomed the sensation. Discomfort breeds compliance. and a freezing room triggers primal subconscious anxiety. I replaced the standard mahogany chair at the head of the table with a sleek, transparent glass desk. The visual separation was intentional. I did not want to sit among them. I needed to sit above them. I placed the pristine acquisition contract in the exact center of the glass surface. The heavy stack of paper contained the lethal liability transfer clause and the mandatory federal compliance trigger. The trap lay dormant, waiting for a signature to activate its fatal mechanism. I opened a small velvet box and removed a solid obsidian block. I set it carefully on the front edge of the desk, positioning it so the overhead spotlights caught the engraved silver lettering. Emmett Vale, Chief Executive Officer. I took my seat behind the glass desk and smoothed the lapels of my tailored white blazer. I pulled up the live security feed on my hidden monitor. The digital clock in the corner of the screen ticked forward. 8:45. The revolving doors on the ground floor spun, capturing my undivided attention. Julian Cross and Savannah Sterling stepped into the sprawling marble lobby. My pulse maintained a steady, resting rhythm of 60 beats per minute. I watched them navigate the security turnstiles. They moved with the synchronized swagger of conquerors arriving to claim their spoils. Savannah treated the corporate lobby like a personal runway. She wore an ostentatious cream-colored designer suit paired with towering stilettos. She carried a rare, exotic leather handbag, swinging it with a profound sense of entitlement. She clearly believed her illicit maneuverings had reached their triumphant conclusion. She assumed the $30 million payout was a guaranteed certainty, unaware that the funds she planned to spend on beachfront estates existed solely as a digital mirage. Julian walked beside her, his strides long and arrogant. He wore a sharp, custom-fitted charcoal suit, projecting the image of an unstoppable tech visionary. However, the high-definition security cameras captured the subtle, involuntary tells of a man buckling under unseen pressure. He compulsively adjusted his silk tie every few steps. His jaw remained clenched so tight the muscles twitched beneath his skin. His primary commercial lenders had filed emergency injunctions less than 12 hours ago, threatening to freeze his operating accounts by Friday. He was drowning in toxic debt, and he viewed this 9 o'clock meeting as his sole remaining lifeboat. Marcus stepped into the frame, intercepting them near the private elevators. My proxy executive played his role with flawless precision. He offered a deferential nod, extending his hand to Julian. Julian grasped it firmly, puffing out his chest, eager to assert his dominance over the man he believed was purchasing his failing enterprise. Savannah did not bother shaking hands. She merely offered a tight, condescending smile, eager to bypass the pleasantries and secure her fortune. The trio stepped into the elevator cabin. The steel doors slid shut. I switched the video feed to the interior elevator camera. The ride to the executive floor took exactly 90 seconds. I watched Savannah lean close to Julian, whispering into his ear. A smug, victorious grin stretched across his face. He patted the breast pocket of his suit, likely verifying the presence of his favorite silver pen. They were actively dividing the spoils of a war they had already lost. They thought they were ascending to the pinnacle of Miami high society. They were actually riding a motorized carriage directly to their own execution. The elevator chimed. The feed switched to the penthouse corridor. Marcus led them down the long, silent hallway. The dark slate walls seemed to absorb the sound of Savannah's clicking heels. Julian rolled his shoulders backward, preparing to deliver his final arrogant performance. He believed he was about to sit across from a desperate conglomerate board ready to dictate terms and walk away an undisputed victor. They reached the end of the hall. The heavy oak doors of the primary boardroom loomed before them, standing 12 feet tall and reinforced with solid brass fixtures. Marcus reached out and gripped the handles. He did not speak. He simply pushed the heavy doors inward. The hinges swung silently, revealing the expansive, freezing room. Julian stepped forward, raising his chin to project maximum authority. He expected to see a table lined with anxious corporate lawyers and eager investors. He expected Marcus to take the seat at the head of the room. Instead, Marcus stepped to the side, remaining firmly in the corridor. He gestured for Julian and Savannah to enter the boardroom alone. Julian crossed the threshold. Savannah followed closely behind him, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her side. I sat perfectly still behind the glass desk, my hands folded neatly over the acquisition contract. The overhead spotlights illuminated my white blazer, turning me into a focal point of stark, undeniable clarity against the dark walls of the room. Julian stopped walking. The physical impact of the identity reveal hit him with the force of a concrete wall. His forward momentum died instantly. His expensive Italian leather shoes scuffed loudly against the hardwood floor. The smug, practiced grin shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The blood drained from his face at a terrifying speed, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His brain struggled to process the impossible visual data rendering in front of his eyes. He blinked rapidly, his breathing hitching in his throat. He stared at the woman sitting in the seat of supreme power. He saw the same face he abandoned on a ventilator 7 years ago. But the frail, helpless victim no longer existed. In her place sat an apex predator, radiating cold, untouchable authority. His eyes slowly tracked downward, drawn by the glare of the spotlights reflecting off the silver lettering on my desk. He read the engraved obsidian block. Emmett Vale, Chief Executive Officer. His lungs seized. His tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too large for his shrinking frame. He tried to take a breath, but his chest barely moved. The catastrophic realization anchored his feet to the floor. The faceless billionaire he spent weeks desperately trying to swindle was the exact same woman he left to die in a Central Florida intensive care unit. Savannah bumped hard into his back, annoyed by his sudden halt. She let out a sharp sigh of irritation and stepped around his frozen body. She looked toward the head of the room, her brow furrowed in deep annoyance. She recognized my face from the rooftop networking lounge. Her immediate assumption was steeped in sheer vanity. She believed the pathetic freelance coder had somehow snuck into the Apex building to serve coffee or beg for a low-level job. Then her gaze dropped to the CEO nameplate. The transition from arrogant annoyance to profound, paralyzing horror took exactly 2 seconds. Savannah dropped her exotic leather handbag. The expensive purse hit the floor with a heavy, unceremonious thud, spilling a gold-plated compact mirror and a tube of crimson lipstick across the polished wood. Her jaw unhinged. She stared at me, the blood rushing in her ears, finally comprehending the lethal magnitude of her boasting at the charity mixer. She had proudly confessed to federal bank fraud directly into the hidden microphone of the billionaire acquiring her company. The silence in the freezing boardroom stretched into an eternity. Neither of them could formulate a single syllable. The towering walls of their fabricated empire were crumbling around them in real time, and the dust was suffocating their ability to speak. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the pristine glass surface. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured cadence of a judge delivering a fatal verdict. "Close the doors behind you, Julian," I commanded, my voice slicing through the icy air. "We have a $30 million contract to finalize, and your creditors are running out of patience. Please take a seat. I am Emmett Vale," and the heavy oak door remained open behind them, framing the empty slate corridor. Julian stood paralyzed for another long moment, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic rhythms. The frigid air of the boardroom bit into his skin, yet a fresh layer of sweat beaded along his hairline. He looked at the CEO nameplate resting on my glass desk, then back to my face. The human brain is a fascinating survival engine. When confronted with an inescapable, terrifying reality, a sociopathic mind will reflexively rewrite the narrative to protect its own fragile ego. I watched the exact second Julian convinced himself he was still in control. He reached back and pulled the heavy brass handle. The thick wood swung inward, latching shut with a resounding click that sealed the 3 of us inside the soundproof vault. Savannah remained frozen near her dropped handbag, her crimson lipstick smeared across the polished floorboards. But Julian stepped forward. He forced his shoulders to drop, adopting a relaxed, casual posture that brutally clashed with his pale complexion. "Emmett," he breathed, letting out a hollow, manufactured chuckle. You always did have a flair for the dramatic. I have to admit, you pulled one over on me. He walked toward the single chair positioned across from my desk. He did not ask for permission to sit. He dropped into the leather seat, resting his elbows on his knees, leaning forward to project an aura of intimate familiarity. He grew up in a manicured suburb of Atlanta, raised by parents who bought his way out of every academic suspension and legal misdemeanor. He learned at a very young age that accountability was an illusion reserved for the lower classes. He firmly believed that any consequence could be erased if he simply smiled and spun a compelling story. He was about to try his favorite tactic on the woman he left to suffocate. It is incredible to see you looking so healthy, Julian continued, lowering his voice into a soft, sympathetic register. I know the past few years have been a mystery to you. I know how my departure must have looked from the outside. But you have to understand the immense psychological toll your illness took on me. I maintained unblinking eye contact, letting his words fall onto the freezing floor. I was young, he said, shaking his head with a practiced look of profound sorrow. The doctors were offering terrible prognoses. The medical bills were piling up, and the logistics startup was barely surviving. I experienced a severe mental breakdown, Emmett. I had to step away to save my own sanity. It was an emotionally complex situation, a tragedy for both of us. But look at you now. You used that space to build something remarkable. In a way, my leaving was the catalyst you needed to achieve your true potential. He was actively attempting to take credit for my corporate empire, framing his cruel abandonment as a noble sacrifice designed to foster my independence. It was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. He thought he could gaslight a forensic data analyst using cheap therapeutic buzzwords. I did not offer him a single nod of validation. I did not raise my voice to argue the merits of his fabricated breakdown. Emotional engagement was the currency he desperately wanted to trade. I refused to open my wallet. I tapped my manicured index finger against the thick stack of acquisition papers resting on the glass desk. The sharp sound echoed through the chilled air. Your primary commercial lenders filed an emergency injunction yesterday evening. I stated, my tone devoid of any human warmth. They will freeze your operating accounts by noon tomorrow. You are currently defaulting on 3 coastal warehouse leases. You are holding a $30 million contract that represents your sole avenue of avoiding total financial ruin. Julian flinched, the sharp recitation of his failures piercing his carefully constructed armor. The sympathetic smile vanished, replaced by a defensive scowl. I tapped the contract a second time. Sign the papers, Julian. He stared at the thick document. The gears in his mind ground together, desperately searching for leverage. Then the red herring I planted during his preliminary pitch illuminated his thoughts. He remembered Marcus claiming that Apex Holdings was hemorrhaging capital. He remembered my proxy executive begging for his proprietary routing algorithm to save the upcoming shareholder meeting. The narcissism surged back into his veins, a toxic adrenaline masking his impending doom. He leaned back in the leather chair, crossing his right leg over his left knee. "You know, Emmett," he said, a smug, arrogant grin returning to his face. For a moment, I thought this entire setup was just an elaborate revenge plot. I thought you brought me up here to gloat. But you are a businesswoman now. You did the math. You looked at your failing third-quarter projections, and you realized you need my software to survive. He gestured broadly around the expansive boardroom. You built a nice tower, but your infrastructure is crumbling. You brought me here because Cross Logistics holds the only algorithm capable of saving your regional expansion. You are willing to hand me $30 million because you are desperate. I remained perfectly still, allowing his delusion to dictate his actions. He needed to feel victorious. A prey animal will only step willingly into a cage if it believes the bait is a prize. Savannah finally broke her paralysis. She scrambled forward, her high heels sliding on the polished floor. She grabbed the back of Julian's leather chair, her fingers digging fiercely into the upholstery. Her face was a mask of sheer panic. The memory of our rooftop encounter played on a relentless loop inside her head. She knew I possessed a high-definition audio recording of her confessing to federal bank fraud. She knew I was not a desperate buyer. "Julian, do not sign anything," Savannah hissed, her voice trembling with raw fear. "We need to leave right now. We need to call our lawyers." Julian brushed her hand off his shoulder with a sharp, dismissive swat. "Stop being hysterical, Savannah," he snapped, not bothering to look at her. "Emmett is playing hardball, but the numbers do not lie. She needs our tech. We are securing the bag, and we are walking out of here." He reached into his breast pocket and extracted his favorite silver pen. The metal caught the harsh glare of the overhead spotlights. He leaned over the glass desk and pulled the acquisition contract toward his chest. I watched him flip past the initial terms. He scanned the generous payout structure, his eyes lighting up at the sheer volume of zeros printed on the page. He turned to page 3, reviewing the severance packages for his dummy board of directors. Then his fingers turned the paper to page 4. The liability transfer clause stared directly back at him. He paused. His eyes skimmed the dense legal jargon. The text explicitly mandated that the signer personally verified the accuracy of all past financial disclosures, under penalty of perjury, waiving all corporate immunity. The following paragraph detailed the mandatory federal compliance audit, requiring an immediate transmission of his unredacted financial history to the Securities and Exchange Commission. His lead corporate attorney had warned him about this exact page. His lawyer had explicitly instructed him to reject the offer and demand standard terms, calling the clauses an act of corporate suicide. But Julian Cross was standing at the precipice of bankruptcy, holding a pen that could instantly transform him into a multi-millionaire. He looked at me sitting behind the transparent desk. He saw a woman he had successfully manipulated, abused, and discarded in the past. He firmly believed I was incapable of defeating him in a battle of intellect. He convinced himself that the restrictive clauses were simply standard boilerplate language designed to intimidate lesser executives. He believed his offshore shell companies were invisible. He thought he was untouchable. "You always were a stickler for administrative paperwork," Julian mocked, shaking his head at the dense legal text. "I suppose I can humor your paranoid compliance department." Savannah lunged forward, grabbing his forearm. "Julian, I am begging you. She recorded me. She knows about the house. She knows everything." Julian yanked his arm free, his face twisting in genuine anger. "Shut up," he barked, his voice echoing loudly across the room. "You are embarrassing me. I built this empire, and I am saving it. Let me conduct my business." He smoothed the heavy paper flat against the glass. He pressed the nib of the silver pen onto the signature line. The scratch of the ink flowing onto the page sounded like a match striking a coarse surface. He signed his name with rapid, confident strokes. He moved to the subsequent pages, initialing the liability transfer, validating the federal compliance trigger, and officially surrendering his corporate armor. He legally bound his own Social Security number to a $50 million federal embezzlement scheme. He flipped to the final page and executed the concluding signature. He capped his silver pen and tossed it onto the desk. He pushed the heavy stack of contracts across the smooth glass, sliding them directly into my waiting hands. "There you go, Emmett," Julian stated, settling back into his chair with a heavy sigh of relief. "Cross Logistics belongs to Apex Holdings. The algorithm is yours. I expect the wire transfer to hit my accounts by the end of the business day. It has been a pleasure doing business with you." He smiled, a genuine expression of profound, arrogant satisfaction. He believed he had won the war. He believed he had secured his future and defeated his past in a single stroke of his pen. I placed my manicured hands on the executed contract. I felt the slight indentation of his signature pressing into the thick paper. The trap was no longer a theoretical construct. The jaws had snapped shut, and the steel teeth were buried deep into his flesh. He just did not feel the pain, yet. I looked at Julian, the corners of my mouth curling upward into a terrifying, authentic smile. The time for silent observation was over. It was time to pull the curtain back and reveal the true cost of his greed. The boardroom remained freezing, but the atmosphere rapidly shifted from tense negotiation to impending execution. The next conflict was not a matter of signatures or legal posturing. It was a matter of undeniable, high-definition proof. I reached under the rim of the glass desk and pressed a hidden silver button. The heavy mechanized blinds covering the floor-to-ceiling windows began to descend, plunging the room into darkness. The real presentation was about to begin. The motorized blinds descended with a smooth, mechanical hum, sealing off the harsh Miami sunlight. Shadows swallowed the expansive boardroom, leaving only the focused overhead spotlights illuminating my glass desk and the freshly signed acquisition contract. The ambient temperature felt even colder in the sudden darkness. Julian shifted in his leather chair. His smug satisfaction wavered, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He looked toward the door, then back to me, his brow furrowing. He opened his mouth to ask a question, but I did not give him the opportunity to speak. I pressed a silver key on my keyboard. A high-definition laser projector mounted on the ceiling roared to life. A blinding beam of pure white light sliced through the chilled air, hitting the blank wall directly behind my chair. The display spanned 20 feet across, rendering digital text in crisp, undeniable clarity. I watched the bright blue glow reflect in Julian's widening eyes. The first slide populated. It was not a routing algorithm or a regional expansion proposal. It was a master financial ledger intercepted directly from the internal servers of Cross Logistics. I highlighted a specific column in bright red. The numbers tracked a recurring diversion of corporate capital, bypassing standard payroll accounts and funneling into an encrypted payment gateway. Julian stopped breathing. His posture crumbled. He gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning stark white. He recognized the digital spreadsheet immediately. You assumed my data analytics firm was failing. I began, my voice steady, projecting across the quiet room. You thought I needed your proprietary software to save my third-quarter projections. Julian, your algorithm is a patchwork of outdated code. It is inefficient, redundant, and functionally useless to a conglomerate like Apex Holdings. I did not bring you here to buy your technology. I brought you here to buy your debt. I clicked a remote resting on my desk. The projection shifted. A complex web of digital transactions appeared, mapping the exact flow of the stolen venture capital. The diagram traced the money from his logistics firm directly into 3 distinct holding trusts registered in Miami. From there, the funds dissolved into luxury yacht leases, offshore equity funds, and a pristine waterfront estate in South Beach. $50 million, I stated, letting the staggering number hang in the frigid air. You generated fictitious invoices for phantom software development. You funneled $50 million of investor capital out of your startup and pumped it into residential real estate shells. You are not a tech visionary. You are operating a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. Growing up, Julian never possessed the discipline for authentic success. He cheated on college exams, charmed his way out of missed deadlines, and expected the world to hand him trophies for minimal effort. He spent his entire life searching for shortcuts. When he married me, he found a workhorse to carry his financial burdens. When he left me in the intensive care unit, he found a willing accomplice in Savannah, someone who shared his insatiable appetite for unearned wealth. They fed each other's worst instincts, building a house of cards on a foundation of federal wire fraud. Julian opened his mouth, his jaw trembling. He tried to project righteous indignation, but his voice cracked. You hacked my servers, he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the projection. That is illegal. That data is inadmissible. You cannot prove any of this. I have corporate immunity. My lawyers will bury you. I offered a slow, chilling smile. You are relying on the corporate veil, I replied. You believe the limited liability shield protects your personal assets from your business failures? You think a judge will simply liquidate your office furniture and let you walk away with your offshore millions. I pressed the remote again. The massive projection shifted to a scanned image of a legal document. It was not a corporate ledger. It was a home equity line of credit application. The property address listed at the top belonged to my premarital home in Orlando. Savannah gasped. The sound tore through the quiet room like a physical scream. She backed away from Julian, pressing her shoulders against the dark slate wall. Her exotic leather handbag remained abandoned on the floor. She stared at the projection, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She recognized the paperwork she had fraudulently notarized 7 years ago. I magnified the digital document, zooming in on the bottom of the final page. The authorization signature filled the 20-foot wall. The cursive script spelled out my name. "Do you remember our cramped kitchen in Central Florida?" I asked, dropping my voice to a dangerous whisper. "Do you remember when I taught you how to sign for my courier packages? I showed you how to mimic my handwriting so you could handle my deliveries while I worked late shifts to pay your rent." I clicked a laser pointer, directing a bright green dot onto the capital E in Emmett. The dot highlighted a very specific, deliberate flaw in the ink, a disconnected loop at the top apex of the letter. "I taught you a broken version of my signature." I continued my words, striking him like physical blows. "It was a joke, a simple way to distinguish your fake mark from my authentic legal script. You used that exact flawed signature to extract $250,000 from my property while I was trapped on a ventilator. You submitted this forged document to a federally insured bank." Julian looked at the massive letter E on the wall. The undeniable proof of his federal bank fraud stared right back at him. The arrogant tech founder facade evaporated entirely, leaving behind a terrified, cornered animal. His chest heaved. He looked frantically at the heavy oak doors, calculating his chances of escaping the penthouse. "You cannot use this," Julian whispered, his voice breathless and frantic. "It is stolen data. It is a civil dispute. You have no jurisdiction." "I am not relying on stolen data, Julian," I corrected him, placing my hands flat against the pristine glass desk. "I am relying on your own profound greed." I picked up the heavy stack of acquisition papers he had just signed. I held them up, letting the overhead spotlights catch the fresh blue ink. "You refused to read the fine print," I explained, delivering the fatal sequence of logic. "You were so desperate for a $30 million payout, you ignored the warnings of your own legal counsel. Turn your attention to Clause 4B, the total liability transfer." I tapped the paper. "By executing this contract, you legally verified the accuracy of all past financial disclosures under penalty of perjury. You formally waived all corporate immunity regarding pre-existing debt. You just bound your own Social Security number to a $50 million federal embezzlement scheme. You stripped away your own armor." Julian shook his head, his eyes darting wildly. "No, that is a standard boilerplate clause. It does not mean anything." I set the contract down and pointed to the next paragraph. "Clause 7C, I countered, my tone cold and unyielding. "The mandatory federal compliance audit. This clause dictates that upon your signature, an automated, unredacted copy of your company financial history is instantly transmitted to external regulators." The blood drained from his lips. He finally understood the mechanism of the trap. He had not signed an acquisition deal. He had signed a legally binding, irrevocable confession. "The exact second your ink dried," I stated, watching his soul crush under the weight of his own actions, my servers executed the protocol. "Your unredacted ledgers, the proof of your offshore holding trusts, and the forged home equity application were bundled into an encrypted data packet. That packet was transmitted directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service." The silence in the freezing boardroom grew deafening. Julian stared at the glass desk, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. He had walked into the apex holding tower believing he was an untouchable titan of industry. He now realized he had just handed the United States government everything they needed to lock him inside a maximum security federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades. He looked down at his trembling hands. The silver pen he used to sign away his freedom rested inches from my fingers. He was drowning, and the water was rising fast. His instinct for self-preservation kicked into overdrive. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone else to absorb the impact of the falling guillotine. He turned his head slowly, his panicked gaze locking onto his wife, setting the stage for a vicious, desperate betrayal. The fragile alliance holding the corporate founders together snapped with an audible fracture. Julian shifted his terrified gaze from the 20-foot projection on the wall directly to the woman pressing her shoulders against the dark slate. He needed a shield. He needed a body to throw onto the tracks to stop the approaching locomotive. But Savannah possessed identical survival instincts. She recognized the precise moment the logistics empire collapsed into a federal crime scene. She grew up studying the dynamics of power, learning how to attach herself to ascending targets and how to sever ties the second those targets began to sink. Julian was no longer a wealthy tech visionary. He was a sinking anchor, and she refused to let him drag her into the dark water. Savannah let out a piercing shriek. The sound echoed harshly off the freezing glass walls, a raw expression of pure self-preservation. She pushed herself away from the slate wall, creating a vast physical distance between herself and her husband. She raised her hands in front of her chest, palms facing outward, projecting a sudden frantic image of defenselessness. "Julian, what did you do?" Savannah cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured hysteria. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with forced, desperate tears. "Emmett, you have to believe me. I had no idea he was doing this. I thought the company was thriving. He told me our revenue was breaking records." Julian stepped back, his jaw dropping in sheer disbelief. The man who had just planned to blame his wife found himself preemptively stabbed in the back. "You cannot do this," he sputtered, his face turning a mottled shade of red. "You authorized those wire transfers. You set up the dummy corporations. You signed the ledgers." Savannah shook her head vigorously, sending her perfectly styled hair falling around her face in disarray. She clutched the fabric of her expensive cream-colored designer suit, dropping to her knees in a theatrical display of profound victimhood. "I am just an account manager," she sobbed, directing her performance entirely toward me, hoping the shared history of Julian's betrayal might earn her a sliver of mercy. "He is the chief executive officer. He handled the high-level finances. He brought those documents to me and told me they were standard vendor payments. I trusted my husband. I just signed where he told me to sign. I did not understand the routing numbers. I did not know the money was stolen from investors." She pointed a manicured finger at the glowing projection of the home equity loan application. "And I certainly knew nothing about your house, Emmett. He must have forged that paperwork in secret. I would never participate in stealing from a sick woman. I was just the new girlfriend. I did not know anything about his dark past." The sheer audacity of her performance was staggering. She sat on the polished hardwood floor weeping crocodile tears, attempting to erase years of calculated corporate theft by playing the naive, helpless housewife. She gambled on the assumption that federal investigators often viewed spouses as oblivious bystanders in complex white-collar fraud cases. She thought she could pack a suitcase, walk out of the Apex Holdings Tower, and start over with a new wealthy mark. Julian lunged forward, his hands balling into tight fists. He forgot about the freezing room and the undeniable evidence projected on the wall. His rage focused entirely on the woman throwing him to the wolves. "You forged the notary seal on that loan application," he roared, his voice cracking under the strain. "You sat in my office and laughed about taking her equity. You picked out the South Beach estate. You demanded the yacht lease. Do not pretend you are innocent." He tried to drag me down, Savannah pleaded, crawling a few inches closer to my glass desk. She kept her eyes wide, a portrait of desperate innocence. "He manipulated me, Emmett, just like he manipulated you. We are both his victims." I watched the two cornered rats tear each other apart inside the soundproof vault. Their toxic marriage, built entirely on a foundation of shared greed and mutual exploitation, dissolved into a vicious screaming match the exact second they faced real consequences. They possessed zero loyalty. They were parasites feeding off the same decaying host, turning their venom on one another to survive. I did not interrupt their shouting. I did not raise my voice to defend my own honor or dispute her pathetic lies. I let her spin the web of her innocent housewife narrative until she firmly anchored every thread. Then I reached under the rim of my glass desk. I tapped the secondary control terminal linked to the high-fidelity surround sound system embedded in the boardroom walls. I bypassed the standard video presentation software and accessed my secure offline server vault. I located the pristine high-definition audio file captured at the rooftop networking lounge just a few days prior. I dragged the file to the active playback queue. I set the master volume to its maximum threshold. Savannah was still weeping, insisting she knew nothing about the forged signature or the stolen premarital equity. I pressed the enter key. The sharp, crisp sound of clinking champagne flutes and ambient lounge music suddenly blasted through the hidden speakers. The audio quality was immaculate, capturing every subtle frequency of the Miami night. The unexpected noise sliced through the shouting match, freezing both Julian and Savannah in their tracks. Then a voice echoed across the frigid boardroom. The tone was smug, arrogant, and dripping with unearned superiority. "We did not need venture capitalists, Emmett. We had you." Savannah stopped breathing. Her forced tears dried instantly. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her pale and trembling on the hardwood floor. She recognized her own voice echoing from the speakers. The recording continued, amplifying her fatal hubris for the entire room to hear. "When your immune system crashed, Julian panicked. He wanted to sell his car to pay your intensive care bills. I told him that was a pathetic waste of resources. I showed him how to leverage the equity in your premarital house." Julian slowly turned his head, staring down at his wife. The horrific realization washed over his features. The woman who just spent the last 5 minutes claiming she was a naive victim had actively orchestrated the very crime that was currently burying them. Savannah had not merely participated in the fraud, she had authored it. The audio file played the next devastating sequence. "The bank required a signature," my recorded voice asked, sounding perfectly flat and inquisitive. "And Julian knew exactly how to copy yours." Savannah's voice sneered through the surround sound system, her recorded laughter grating against the tense silence of the boardroom. "We sat in his office while you were snoring on a ventilator across town. He traced your name on the home equity application, and I notarized the document myself using a fabricated seal. We pulled $250,000 out of your property in 3 days. We used the sick wife's money to build our empire, and you were too naive to ever notice." The playback ended with a sharp digital click. The ambient lounge music vanished, plunging the boardroom back into a heavy, suffocating silence. I looked down at Savannah. The innocent housewife facade lay shattered in a million irreparable pieces on the floor. Her own words, captured in a moment of blinding vanity, effectively neutralized every single lie she just attempted to sell. There was no plausible deniability. There was no blaming the chief executive officer. She had confessed to federal bank fraud conspiracy and forgery, proudly declaring her role as the mastermind behind the stolen equity. "You were saying I asked my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the lethal weight of a falling gavel." Savannah could not form a response. She stared at the speaker grills mounted in the walls as if they were loaded firearms. She squeezed her eyes shut, wrapping her arms around her stomach. The profound gravity of her mistake crushed the remaining oxygen from her lungs. She had sought me out at that networking event to inflict emotional pain. She wanted to gloat over my perceived failure. Instead, she had willingly handed me the exact confession the federal prosecutors needed to ensure she served a decade behind bars alongside her husband. Julian looked from the projection of the forged signature to his wife cowering on the floor, and finally to the signed acquisition contract resting on my desk. His mind short-circuited. Every exit was sealed. Every lie was exposed. Every piece of stolen wealth was digitally tracked and legally bound to his personal identity. The trap was executed with flawless mathematical precision. The air in the room grew stale and tight. The silence stretched, amplifying the sound of their shallow, rapid breathing. They had nothing left to say. The war was over, and they had surrendered everything. I sat back in my leather chair, waiting for the final mechanism to engage. I did not have to wait long. A faint, distant sound pierced the thick, soundproofed glass of the penthouse windows. It started as a low wail, rising and falling in a rhythmic, aggressive cadence. The noise drifted up from the busy streets of downtown Miami, cutting through the ambient traffic. Julian lifted his head. His eyes widened, fixing on the motorized blinds covering the windows. The sound grew louder. The pitch sharpened. The distinct, terrifying howl of multiple emergency sirens echoed off the surrounding skyscrapers. It was not a single police cruiser responding to a traffic collision. The synchronized, overlapping wails indicated a coordinated, rapid response from a massive tactical unit. The federal compliance trigger embedded in the acquisition contract had done exactly what it was designed to do. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service do not ignore undeniable, digitally verified evidence of a $50 million embezzlement scheme. When a suspect hands them the financial ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and a signed confession on a silver platter, the government moves with terrifying speed. The sirens wailed louder, approaching the base of the Apex Holdings tower. The pitch shifted as the heavy vehicles slammed on their brakes, securing the perimeter of the high-rise. Julian stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the slate wall. He looked at me, a profound primal fear consuming his features. The realization of his immediate future paralyzed his limbs. "They are here," Savannah whispered, her voice cracking as she pressed her forehead against her knees. "They are actually here." I remained seated behind the glass desk, observing the final moments of their freedom. I had promised myself in that cold intensive care unit that Julian Cross would pay for every single hour I spent in that hospital bed. The bill had finally come due, and the collectors were currently riding the elevator up to the executive floor. The real world was about to break through the heavy oak doors, bringing an entirely new level of devastation to their crumbling empire. The wailing sirens outside the tinted windows abruptly ceased, replaced by the screech of heavy tires gripping the pavement directly below the tower. The sudden silence that followed felt far more terrifying than the noise. Inside the freezing boardroom, Julian stood pressed against the dark slate wall, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. Savannah remained crumpled on the hardwood floor, her designer suit wrinkled, her mascara running in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. They did not sound like the measured professional strides of corporate executives. They were heavy, synchronized, and moving with urgent, tactical precision. The brass handles of the heavy oak doors turned downward. The doors were pushed open with firm, unyielding force, hitting the doorstops with a sharp crack. 6 federal agents stepped into the room. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with stark yellow lettering printed across their chests and backs. 3 represented the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The other 3 bore the insignia of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. They did not pause to admire the panoramic view of Biscayne Bay or the sleek glass desk. They moved with the cold, sterile efficiency of a surgical team stepping up to an operating table. The lead agent, a tall woman with steel gray hair and a rigid posture, walked straight toward the center of the room. She bypassed my desk entirely, her eyes locked onto the 2 targets cowering in the shadows, Julian Cross and Savannah Sterling. The agent announced, her voice a flat, bureaucratic drone that offered zero room for negotiation. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, tax evasion, and forgery." Julian shook his head, raising his trembling hands in a futile gesture of surrender. "Wait," he stammered, his vocal cords constricting. "There is a misunderstanding. I have an attorney. I need to call my general counsel. We are in the middle of a corporate acquisition." "You have the right to remain silent," the agent continued, stepping into his personal space and ignoring his desperate plea. She reached to her tactical belt and withdrew a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic rasp of the chain links shifting against each other sliced through the quiet room. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." An agent stepped behind Julian, grasping his wrists with practiced, inescapable strength. Julian offered no physical resistance. His knees buckled slightly, his expensive leather shoes scuffing the floor as his arms were pulled behind his back. The rigid steel cuffs ratcheted shut around his wrists. The sharp, mechanical clicking sound signaled the official end of his tech visionary facade. He was no longer a founder. He was a federal inmate. Savannah reacted with raw, unvarnished panic. As two agents approached her, she scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her high heels scraping desperately against the polished wood. "No!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass walls. "Do not touch me. I am just the wife. I did not sign the main ledgers. Emmett, tell them. Tell them I was just an employee." Her attempt to bargain fell on deaf ears. An agent gripped her upper arm, hauling her to her feet with swift, indifferent force. Savannah thrashed her shoulders, trying to shake off the physical restraint, but the agent smoothly secured her wrists behind her back. The steel cuffs locked tightly over the sleeves of her cream-colored blazer. She began to sob openly, her chest heaving, the scent of her fear overpowering her imported jasmine perfume. I remained seated behind my transparent desk, my hands folded neatly over the executed contract. I watched the physical manifestation of justice unfold without blinking. I did not smile. I did not offer a parting remark. I simply observed them as they were stripped of their unearned dignity. Julian turned his head, his hollow eyes meeting mine for one final second. He looked for a trace of anger, a flicker of vindictive joy, anything to prove he still affected my emotional state. He found only an endless, freezing void. I offered him a single, subtle nod. It was the dismissal of an executioner authorizing the removal of the condemned. The agents turned the prisoners around and marched them toward the exit. Julian shuffled his feet, his posture slouched, staring blankly at the floor. Savannah continued to weep, her sobs echoing down the slate corridor as the heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, sealing me back inside my quiet sanctuary. I reached across the desk and tapped a sequence on my keyboard. The primary monitor switched from the offline forensic vault to the live security feed covering the ground floor lobby. I had orchestrated this timing with meticulous care. Julian had demanded the morning signing ceremony because his creditors were closing in, but he still wanted to control the public narrative. He had explicitly invited his entire board of directors and a dozen local financial journalists to gather in the lobby of the Apex Holdings Tower. He promised them an exclusive announcement regarding a lucrative acquisition that would reshape the logistics sector. He wanted an audience for his triumph. I provided the audience. The security feed displayed a packed lobby. Venture capitalists stood in small clusters, sipping coffee from paper cups, murmuring about stock valuations. Reporters held digital recorders and professional cameras, waiting impatiently near the velvet ropes positioned in front of the private elevators. They expected a triumphant chief executive officer to emerge, holding a signed contract, ready to pose for the cover of a business magazine. The silver doors of the primary elevator chimed. The crowd fell silent, turning their attention to the polished steel panels. The doors slid apart. The visual shock rippled through the lobby like a seismic tremor. Julian and Savannah stood inside the elevator cabin, flanked by federal agents in tactical gear. Their hands were visibly restrained behind their backs. The smug, arrogant conquerors who had strutted through the turnstiles less than an hour ago now resembled terrified, broken animals dragged into the harsh sunlight. The journalists reacted with predatory speed. A chorus of camera shutters erupted, sounding like a swarm of angry locusts. Blinding white flashbulbs turned the marble lobby into a chaotic, strobe-lit nightmare. The reporters surged forward, pressing against the velvet ropes, shouting frantic questions. Julian lowered his chin to his chest, desperately trying to shield his face from the relentless flashes. He squeezed his eyes shut, but there was nowhere to hide. His board of directors watched in sheer horror. The older men in tailored suits physically recoiled, covering their mouths, their faces turning a sickly shade of ash. They recognized the tactical jackets of the federal agents. They instantly realized their equity was worthless and their corporate reputations were tethered to a sinking anchor. Savannah tripped on her towering stilettos as an agent guided her forward. She stumbled, dropping to her knees in front of a photographer. The camera flashed directly into her tear-streaked face, capturing her humiliation in perfect high definition. An agent pulled her back to her feet, marching her toward the revolving doors. The feed showed the agents loading them into the back of two separate black sport utility vehicles idling on the curb. The heavy doors slammed shut, and the vehicles merged into the busy Miami traffic, carrying my abusers toward a concrete holding cell. A quiet knock echoed from the back of the boardroom. Marcus stepped inside, holding his secure tablet. He walked over to my glass desk, his expression serious, though a faint gleam of professional satisfaction shone in his eyes. "The extraction is complete," Marcus reported, setting the tablet on the edge of my desk. "The press is already publishing the photos online. Cross Logistics stock has been suspended from trading pending a federal inquiry. The board of directors is currently scrambling to secure independent legal counsel." I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the tension slowly bleed from my shoulders. "And the secondary targets?" Marcus swiped the screen of his tablet. Federal asset forfeiture protocols moved swiftly once the audio confession authenticated the origin of the stolen capital. The warrants were executed simultaneously across the city. He read from the encrypted dispatch. Harper Cross was enjoying a morning session at her private country club in Coral Gables. She attempted to purchase a spa package, but her platinum cards declined. As she argued with the concierge, federal marshals arrived at the front desk. They formally served her with asset seizure notices. Because she knowingly received funds funneled from the dummy corporations the government considers her bank accounts, repositories for laundered money. Harper spent her entire life shielding her brother and mocking the vulnerable. She thrived on inherited privilege and stolen wealth. She looked down on me when I was sick, assuming her financial safety net was impenetrable. Her primary residence is currently being locked down by the authorities. Marcus continued, his voice steady. They impounded her luxury vehicles in the club parking lot. She possesses zero liquid capital and no legal access to her credit lines. She was last seen waiting for a rideshare on the curb, carrying a single gym bag. She is entirely destitute. The enabler had been stripped of her unearned crown. The ecosystem of toxic vanity that sustained their cruelty was permanently dismantled. They had all funded their luxury by draining my lifeblood, and now the federal government was draining theirs. My secure phone vibrated on the desk, interrupting the quiet hum of the boardroom. The caller identification displayed the encrypted number of my lead corporate attorney. I picked up the device and pressed the green icon. "The grand jury indictment was processed with unprecedented speed," my attorney stated, bypassing any pleasantries. "The volume of the evidence you provided left the defense counsel with zero leverage. They are attempting to negotiate a plea agreement to avoid a prolonged trial, but the prosecutors are aiming for maximum statutory penalties." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the white clouds drift over the glittering blue expanse of Biscayne Bay. When is the hearing? "The judge has scheduled the final sentencing for the first week of next month," the attorney confirmed. I ended the call and set the phone down next to the engraved obsidian block bearing my name. The board was swept clean. The pieces were locked in their respective cages. Only the final judgment remained, the closing chapter of a story written in silence and executed with unbreakable patience. The federal courthouse in downtown Miami stands as a monument of rigid stone and unyielding architectural angles designed to project the severe authority of the justice system. I did not attend the sentencing hearing. Standing in a crowded gallery to watch a broken man weep offered zero strategic value. My physical presence was entirely unnecessary. The forensic data had already secured the conviction. Instead, I sat at my glass desk in the penthouse looking out over Biscayne Bay while listening to a secure audio relay provided by my lead corporate attorney. The judge presiding over the case possessed a reputation for zero tolerance regarding white-collar fraud. He read the verdict with a sterile, bureaucratic cadence that offered no room for emotional interpretation. The gavel struck the heavy wooden block. The sharp, decisive crack echoed through my desktop speakers, signaling the official end of an empire built on illusions. Julian Cross was found guilty on all counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and forgery. The judge cited the brazen nature of the theft, noting how Julian exploited a medically incapacitated spouse to extract unearned capital. The sentence dropped like a steel anvil. 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The federal sentencing guidelines dictated no chance for early parole. Through the encrypted audio feed, I heard a sharp intake of breath. Julian let out a hollow, stifled sob. My attorney later reported that Julian turned his head toward the gallery, desperately searching the rows of wooden benches for my face. He wanted a final moment of connection. He needed a chance to project his victimhood onto the woman he betrayed. He found only empty seats. Federal marshals gripped his arms and dragged him out of the courtroom. The tech visionary was erased from society, reduced to a generic inmate number. Savannah faced the judge next. Her defense attorneys attempted a pathetic strategy, arguing she was a manipulated dependent. They tried to shift the burden of guilt solely onto her husband. The pristine audio recording of her boasting on the rooftop lounge dismantled that defense with surgical precision. The judge sentenced her to 10 years as a willing co-conspirator. Her shrieks of protest echoed through the feed, quickly silenced by the heavy oak doors closing behind her as she was escorted to a transport vehicle. The collateral damage extended beyond the courtroom. Harper Cross, the entitled socialite who enabled the abuse and mocked my illness, faced severe financial ruin. Federal investigators traced the stolen venture capital directly into her vanity projects and country club accounts. The government seized her remaining assets. She was evicted from her luxury condominium and banished from her elite social circles. The woman who thrived on inherited privilege now works minimum wage retail shifts just to afford a studio apartment on the fringes of the city. With the architects of the fraud locked away, I turned my attention to the rotting remnants of their hollow enterprise. The acquisition contract I engineered granted Apex Holdings total ownership of Cross Logistics. The company was functionally insolvent, drowning in unpayable debt. But the federal government seized the offshore holding trusts to satisfy the defrauded investors. What remained in my legal possession were the physical assets and the functional fragments of their routing code. I dispatched my executive team to execute a swift, unceremonious liquidation. I did not want a single trace of Julian's legacy to survive. My contractors terminated the coastal warehouse leases, selling the routing contracts to a rival shipping firm for a fraction of their market value. We auctioned off the executive luxury vehicles, the imported office furniture, and the extravagant artwork Savannah purchased for the lobby. We stripped their proprietary algorithm down to its base components, extracting a few usable lines of code to integrate into my own software, and permanently deleted the rest. The liquidation process generated a modest sum of clean, untainted capital. It was a mere fragment of a tech fortune, but I refused to absorb those specific funds into my personal wealth. I earmarked that money for a distinct, highly targeted objective. A week after the sentencing, I ordered my driver to take me north on the highway. We left the glittering skyline of Miami behind, navigating toward the industrial edges of Central Florida. The state-mandated transport van had driven this exact route 7 years ago, carrying a frail, discarded patient toward a bleak future. The black sport utility vehicle pulled up to the curb. I stepped onto the cracked asphalt, the humid air instantly clinging to my tailored suit. The low-income rehabilitation clinic looked exactly as I remembered. The exterior walls featured peeling beige paint, and the chain-link fence sagged under the weight of overgrown weeds. This was the grim facility where I learned how to walk again. This was the cramped, suffocating building where I gripped cold steel parallel bars, forcing my atrophied muscles to rebuild while nursing a shattered reality. The clinic was currently facing imminent foreclosure. State funding had dried up, and the municipal board planned to sell the lot to a commercial developer. I walked through the sliding glass doors. The lobby smelled of stale bleach and boiled cabbage, triggering a vivid rush of sensory memories. I did not visit the front desk to ask for a tour. I had already purchased the deed. I met with the regional health director in a cramped administrative office. The man looked exhausted, drowning in paperwork and overdue invoices. I sat across from his metal desk and handed him a binding financial endowment funded entirely by the liquidated assets of Cross Logistics. I outlined a comprehensive renovation protocol. The crumbling linoleum floors would be torn up. The oppressive acoustic ceiling tiles would be removed. I authorized the purchase of elite physical therapy equipment, advanced diagnostic machines, and premium patient accommodations. I funded salaries to attract top-tier medical talent to the forgotten district. I dictated a singular, non-negotiable condition for the sweeping endowment. The facility would be transformed into a state-of-the-art intensive care recovery wing. It would provide free, comprehensive rehabilitation services to abandoned patients suffering from severe medical debt. The director stared at the contract, his eyes welling with shock. He asked what name I wanted placed on the front of the new building. He assumed I wanted the Vale family crest etched into the stone, seeking the standard philanthropic glory. I declined. I instructed him to name the new wing after the 2 night shift nurses who bathed me, fed me, and offered quiet dignity when my husband left me to die. I ensured the legacy of that building would honor the individuals who actually sustained human life, funded entirely by the ruin of those who tried to destroy it. It was the purest form of poetic justice. I returned to Miami as the sun began its descent. The sky burned in vibrant shades of bruised purple and fierce orange. I bypassed my command center and took the private elevator directly to my residential penthouse. I poured a glass of sparkling water and stepped out onto the expansive glass balcony. The ocean breeze whipped through my hair, carrying the sharp, clean scent of salt and endless possibility. Far below, the city pulsed with frantic energy. Millions of people rushed through their lives chasing money, seeking validation, and fighting loud, useless battles over fragile egos. Society conditions victims to believe that justice requires an immediate, explosive reaction. They tell you to scream, to confront your abusers, to demand apologies in the heat of the agonizing moment. They expect you to shatter loudly, providing the narcissist with the exact emotional chaos they crave. I chose a different path. I looked down at the glittering streetlights illuminating the coastline. I built an untouchable empire, not by raising my voice, but by weaponizing my silence. Silence starves the parasite. It provides the quiet necessary space to gather data, construct a flawless strategy, and wait for the enemy to step blindly into the snare. Julian and Savannah believed they could erase me because they mistook my physical weakness for mental surrender. They thought a sick wife was a disposable liability. They failed to realize that true endurance is forged in the darkest, coldest rooms. They tried to bury a victim, unaware they were planting a seed that would grow into their own executioner. The surgical scars on my collarbone no longer ache in the winter humidity. They are permanent silver reminders of the exact price of my liberation. I am Emmett Vale. I survived the ultimate betrayal, and I transformed my trauma into a financial guillotine. The board is swept clean. The game is officially over. And I am the only player left standing in the light. When the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut on Julian Cross, sealing his fate for the next 15 years, the echo reverberated far beyond the walls of that courtroom. It is easy to look at the spectacular collapse of a fraudulent tech empire and attribute it simply to corporate greed, blinding narcissism, or the intoxicating allure of unearned wealth. We see the yachts, the waterfront estates, and the forged documents, and we categorize it as a thriller of high-stakes deception. But if we peel back the layers of the digital ledgers, the true tragedy of this story is not rooted in a Miami boardroom. It is rooted in a manicured suburban home decades earlier. It is fundamentally a story about the devastating long-term consequences of failed parenting. To understand how a man could stand in a sterile intensive care unit, look at the woman who sacrificed her youth to build his foundation, and leave a sticky note reading, "I didn't sign up for a sick wife." We must examine the soil in which his character was cultivated. Julian did not suddenly become a sociopathic narcissist the day Emmett fell ill. His capacity for profound cruelty was carefully nurtured by parents who believed they were doing the right thing. They bought his way out of academic suspensions. They hired lawyers to erase his legal misdemeanors. They utilized their wealth and status as a protective bubble shielding him from the very concept of accountability. In modern American culture, there is a dangerous, growing misconception regarding family responsibility. We often equate love with protection, believing that a good parent must eliminate every obstacle and absorb every shock their child might face. However, shielding a child from the consequences of their actions does not protect them from the world. It entirely disarms them. When Julian's parents erased his childhood mistakes, they did not teach him resilience. They taught him that rules are mere suggestions for the lower classes. They taught him that reality can always be rewritten if you have enough leverage. They handed him a loaded weapon of entitlement, completely unaware that it would eventually misfire and destroy his entire life. The bedrock of a healthy traditional family structure must be built on the unwavering pillars of honesty and fairness. These are not just quaint, outdated concepts. They are the essential survival tools every child needs to navigate a complex society. When a child breaks a window, fails a test, or betrays a friend, the parent's role is not to sweep up the glass, bribe the teacher, or buy a new friendship. The role of a parent is to stand beside the child as they face the music. It is about guiding them through the uncomfortable, often painful process of making amends and taking ownership of their failures. If Julian had been raised in an environment where fairness was prioritized over appearances, he might have learned the value of a hard-earned dollar. He might have understood that Emmett's late-night coding sessions in their cramped Orlando apartment were acts of profound devotion, not resources to be extracted and discarded. But because he was raised to view himself as the center of the universe, he viewed Emmett not as a partner, but as a utility. When the utility broke down, he simply unplugged it and went shopping for a newer model. This brings us to the critical importance of emotional awareness. In raising children, we spend countless hours focused on their academic achievements, their athletic prowess, and their future earning potential. Yet we frequently neglect their emotional vocabulary. Empathy is not an inherent trait. It is a learned skill. It requires daily practice. It requires a parent to sit down with a child and ask, "How do you think your actions made that person feel?" and then wait for an honest, thoughtful answer. Julian and his sister Harper were devoid of emotional awareness. They operated in a world where other human beings were reduced to non-player characters in the grand video game of their lives. Harper could stand at a charity gala and mock a woman recovering from a catastrophic illness because she was never taught to recognize pain outside of her own minor inconveniences. Julian could forge his comatose wife's signature because he lacked the fundamental neural pathways required to feel guilt. Raising a child without emotional awareness is akin to sending them into the world without a moral compass. They might travel fast and acquire shiny things, but they will inevitably drive themselves off a cliff. A traditional family structure, at its core, is a microcosm of society. It is the training ground where children learn how to negotiate, how to compromise, and how to honor their commitments even when it is wildly inconvenient. In sickness and in health is not just a romantic vow. It is the ultimate test of character. It requires grit. It requires the capacity to put someone else's needs above your own comfort. When parents fail to model this level of profound responsibility, they raise adults who abandon ship at the first sign of a storm. Julian's spectacular downfall serves as a chilling cautionary tale for all of us tasked with the immense responsibility of guiding the next generation. The 15-year federal prison sentence he received was not just the result of wire fraud and tax evasion. It was the final, inescapable bill coming due for a lifetime of avoided consequences. The universe, much like a forensic data analyst, eventually audits us all. We must ask ourselves what kind of adults we are cultivating in our own homes. Are we raising children who possess the fortitude to stand by loved ones in an intensive care unit? Or are we raising children who will run away and leave a sticky note? If we hand them entitlement, they will build a prison. If we hand them accountability, they will build a legacy. Stories like Emmett's remind us that while the shadows of betrayal can be long and cold, the light of truth and calculated patience always, eventually breaks through. If you found yourself captivated by this journey of resilience, strategy, and ultimate justice, make sure to follow the channel Linda Vengeance. Join us for more deeply engaging narratives that explore the darkest corners of human nature and the triumphant, unapologetic return of those who absolutely refuse to be broken. As you go about your day, take a moment to look closely at the reflections in your own life. Look at the children playing in your living room, the teenagers scrolling on their phones, or even the adults you once raised. The values we instill act as invisible ink, writing the scripts they will unconsciously follow for decades to come. When the inevitable storms of life roll in and the comfortable illusions are stripped away, what will remain of the foundation you built for them? Will it hold firm against the crushing weight of reality, or will it crumble into dust at the first sign of pressure? The answer is already being written, quietly, in the choices you make today.